American Comics. My universe begins from the inner world. Chapter 1. New York, Manhattan. Crete General Clinic. Under the shadowless lamp in the operating room, Lynn Crete, dressed in surgical scrubs, looked at the fried avocado on the operating table, unsure where to begin. Bullets, rebar, dust, and a red and black battle suit fused with skin, such injuries were severe, enough to kill an ordinary person 800 times over. But the avocado on the operating table was still winking at him, speaking words to comfort Lynn. Lynn, don't pity me just because I'm handsome. I can take it. Lynn sighed helplessly. He, of course, knew the avocado could take it. He sighed because, Wade, with your abilities, you don't need treatment at all. Wade Wilson, a regular at Crete General Clinic, but also the person least in need of coming to the clinic, because he was Deadpool. Deadpool shook his head wildly, a shocking gash tearing open on his neck, his head flopping weakly to one side. No, I need your treatment. I desperately need it. Stop moving, you fool idiot. Lynn straightened Deadpool's head, looked at the gurgling wound, and said coldly, don't increase my workload. If it fell off, he would have to sew the whole thing back, which would be too troublesome. Lynn, is he still not using anesthesia? The curvaceous nurse asked, cautiously glancing at Deadpool. Even though she was accustomed to all sorts of gory scenes, every time Deadpool came, it was an explosive level of imagery. No, anesthesia doesn't do much for him. Lynn shook his head and said to the nurse, May, you go attend to other matters first. All right. May Parker nodded and hurried out of the operating room. Great. It's just the two of us. I'm already but impatient. Shut up. Lynn grabbed the rebar stuck in Wade's chest, and just as Deadpool was about to mentally pollute Lynn, he yanked the rebar out. PFF'd. A fountain of blood spurted out, but a look of intoxication flashed in Deadpool's eyes. This feeling of being rescued, of proving he was still alive, it was wonderful. Although Lynn was a bit rough with Deadpool, he efficiently treated Deadpool's wounds. After all, if he didn't deal with them quickly, the wounds would all heal. Deadpool sat up from the operating table, looked at his already healed wounds, and thanked Lynn. Lynn, your handiwork is still amazing. I feel like I'm already better. That has little to do with me. Lynn looked at Deadpool with a playful, slightly wicked smile on his lips. Is that so? How about I attach your third leg to your head next time? Deadpool clamped his mouth shut. Because Lynn was truly capable of doing such a thing. Lynn pulled Deadpool up from the operating table and said impatiently, if you're well, hurry up and leave. I have other patients. Deadpool looked at Lynn with a mournful expression, put on the mask he had placed aside, and muttered, heartless man. Scram. Lynn cursed under his breath, and as Deadpool left the operating room, he reminded him, don't forget to pay the surgery fee. Deadpool turned back, chuckled, and playfully made a heart shape with his hands at Lynn. Charge it to my love. With that, he quickly vanished before Lynn could respond. Lynn's mouth twitched, and after feeling a peculiar energy inexplicably appear within his body, a smile appeared on his face. This was the positive, mental energy he gained from helping Deadpool. Gratitude, respect, joy, happiness, adoration, when someone directed these emotions towards him, Lynn could collect this positive, mental energy. The amount of positive, mental energy provided to him was related to the intensity of that person's emotions, and what could provide the most positive energy was faith. Ever since he awakened this peculiar ability 3 years ago, he had begun collecting this positive mental energy. And this positive mental energy currently had only two uses: to strengthen his body and soul, and to provide nourishment for a seed within his body. As for the purpose of that seed, Lynn did not yet know, but he had recently felt a sense that the seed was about to sprout. However, even if only 30% of this positive mental energy flowed to him, 3 years had strengthened his body to a very considerable degree. It should be roughly equivalent to a 50-50 split. Lynn changed out of his surgical scrubs, cleaned and disinfected, then returned to the consultation room, which was only separated from the operating room by a wall. As an unofficial private clinic that occasionally took on shady jobs, it was not only small in area but also had a pitifully small staff. Now, besides him, the doctor, there was only May Parker, who served as both receptionist and assistant, and even occasionally filled in as a nurse. Lin, we really should hire 2 more people. I can't handle it all by myself. May Parker complained to Lin, placing several reports in front of him. We're already hiring, but our situation here is special, so. Lin looked at May Parker apologetically, please bear with it for a few more days. Originally, his clinic had 2 nurses and 1 receptionist. But some time ago, the receptionist resigned due to marriage, 1 nurse was too old and retired 2 weeks ago, and the other nurse was arrested 3 days ago while working a part-time job at night, so only May Parker remained. May Parker nodded helplessly, then suddenly asked, how is Mrs. Crete doing lately? Mrs. Crete, Lin's mother, the founder of this clinic. A year ago, after Freya Crete handed the clinic over to Lin, she basically stopped coming to the clinic, except for some emergencies Lin couldn't handle, and was in a semi-retired state. Lin nodded, his expression peculiar, she's always doing very well. That's true, she. Boom. Boom. A sudden explosion drowned out their conversation. What happened? May Parker frantically steadied the desk in front of her. Lin followed the direction of the sound, turned to look out the window, and his eyes suddenly narrowed. The sky had fallen. A brilliant blue beam of light shot straight into the sky, as if it had blasted a large hole in it, and swirling energy rippled across the sky, like a lake disturbed by ripples. At this moment, scattered, silvery dust-like objects fell from the large hole, and as these silver particles plummeted through the air, spreading out from the sky with a whistling sound, they revealed their ferocious appearance. They were grotesque figures riding on flying devices, their bodies covered in metallic plates, yet also mixed with numerous wires like robots. They rode their strange flying devices, howling through the skies above Manhattan, leaving behind a sky-filling, crisscrossing network of energy beams. And the recent explosions were caused by these guys. Chittori. Lin whispered, then said to May Parker, who was frozen in place, hurry. Take the patients and hide. Many of the Chittori, spreading out like locusts, were flying in his direction, and where those invaders flew, only explosions and devastation were left behind. Okay. May Parker responded somewhat frantically, following behind Lin as he ran out of the consultation room. At this moment, due to the sudden explosions, the patients waiting outside the consultation room had already fallen into chaos. Just as they were at a loss, everyone, follow me. Hurry and hide. Lin shouted, waved to the patients, and carried an immobile patient on his back. He led them towards the underground room that served as a warehouse. Boom. Several energy beams descending from the sky tore through the ceiling, landing near the group and eliciting screams. Don't stop. Keep going. Lin shouted at the crowd, looked up at the sky through the collapsed ceiling, and his eyes suddenly narrowed. A bio-warship, over 100 meters long, resembling the mythical Leviathan beast, was gliding through the air above them. Wherever it passed, grim-faced Chittori soldiers, weapons in hand, dropped from the Leviathan, crashing onto the surrounding buildings. And, unfortunately, a Chittori soldier descending from the sky crashed through the broken ceiling and landed not far from them. Looking at the Chittori soldier that appeared before them, everyone in the clinic widened their eyes in terror, and after a moment of stunned silence, the Chittori soldier aimed his gun at the patients, his Chittori-style weapon lighting up. Their mission was to destroy everything, and these humans before them were naturally included in the scope of destruction. Just then, a figure suddenly rushed towards the Chittori soldier, grabbed the Chittori soldier's weapon, and lifted it up. Boom. A searing white energy beam flew over their heads, blasting another large hole in the already precarious ceiling. May. Move. Lin roared, holding the Chittori soldier's weapon against the opponent's neck, pushing him back against the wall. The terrified crowd snapped out of it. They glanced at Lin, then followed behind May and rushed into the nearby underground warehouse. Lin, come quickly. May Parker poked her head out of the door crack, shouting loudly at Lin, her eyes filled with worry. Close the door. Don't come out. Lin turned back and shouted anxiously. The moment he saw the door close, his expression became calm. He looked at the Chittori soldier pinned against the wall, unable to move, and whispered, "You're really ugly." Crack. Lin twisted the Chittori soldier's neck and snatched his weapon. Boom. An energy beam utterly blasted the Chittori soldier's head into smithereens. Lin twirled the gun in his hand, and just as he was about to head towards the underground warehouse, several more Chidori soldiers crashed through the ceiling and landed in the clinic. Lin immediately moved from his spot, dodging the incoming energy rays. Just as he was about to counterattack, gunshots rang out. Seconds later, a deep red figure appeared before Lin. Hey, my dear Lin baby, did you miss me? Deadpool, clad in a crimson battle suit, held a Chidori soldier's head in his left hand, dangling it between his legs, while his right hand was placed in front of the head. He swayed his body back and forth, striking a bashful pose. Bashful. How could this scoundrel, wearing a mask, still convey such a strong sense of expression? Lin's mouth twitched. He told Deadpool, go get a fever somewhere else. Deadpool's body stiffened. He suddenly threw the Chidori soldier's head aside with a cold expression and loudly shouted, goodbye. I still prefer Lin. Bang. Deadpool took a step back, clutching his eye socket, and let out a soft whimper. Lin calmly retracted his fist. Shut up. You're so domineering, I love it. Deadpool cupped his chin with both hands, looking at Lin bashfully. Lin ignored the madman and instead looked up at the sky. Upon seeing a group of Chidori soldiers on their flying vehicles heading their way, a look of understanding flashed in his eyes. Due to cybernetic modifications, Chidori soldiers can create a hive mind through an electronic neural network, functioning as a thought network terminal. In Legion combat, soldiers can communicate and share combat intelligence in real time through the terminal, enhancing their situational awareness on the battlefield and achieving a seamless command and control effect. However, this also has a fatal flaw. If the thought network terminal is destroyed, all Chidori soldiers connected to it will die instantly. This was also the reason why, in the original plot, after Tony Stark sent the nuclear bomb through the space portal and destroyed the Chidori mothership, all the Chidori on Earth died. So, after Lin eliminated one Chidori soldier and the Chidori's thought network terminal identified a threat here, it sent more Chidori soldiers. And after all these Chidori soldiers were eliminated by Deadpool, it was deemed an even greater threat, so flying soldiers were dispatched. A series of thoughts flashed through Lin's mind. He told Deadpool, hurry. More of them are coming. With that, without waiting for Deadpool's response, he picked up a Chidori weapon and ran out of the clinic. If he wasn't mistaken, these Chidori soldiers were targeting him and Deadpool. As long as the two perceived threats left, May and the patients hidden in the underground room would be temporarily safe. Wait for me. Skywalker. Deadpool shouted loudly, following Lin out of the clinic. Indeed, as they left the clinic, that small squad of flying Chidori soldiers immediately changed direction and pursued them. At this moment, the entire street, the entire Manhattan, was in chaos. Under the Chidori's indiscriminate attacks, energy rays pierced through buildings, detonated cars, and even killed countless humans. Wherever the Chidori soldiers went, they left behind only devastation. Manhattan residents screamed, frantically running to places they believed were safe. Smoke, fire, and screams, the entire Manhattan was enveloped in immense panic. Wow. I never thought I'd get to participate in the filming of a Star Wars movie. Deadpool kept complaining, but he was also constantly watching the approaching Chidori soldiers. When he saw the flying soldiers slightly lower their altitude and the weapons on their flying vehicles flash with dangerous light, he immediately shouted to Lin, dodge. Lin's expression was calm. As dangerous energy beams rained down from midair, he deftly weaved through obstacles on the street. When he stepped onto the roof of a car, an energy ray finally struck the car beneath his feet. Boom. The energy ray detonated the car, but Lin had already leapt forward a second before the explosion. Lin turned in midair, his Chidori energy gun firing energy rays at the flying vehicles in the sky. Boom. Precise shots brought down two Chidori flying soldiers. The moment Lin landed, he immediately sprang away, dodging two subsequent rays. Just then, another explosion sounded. After taking down a flying soldier, Deadpool emerged through the flames and appeared beside Lin. The two ran forward together. Skywalker, draw their attention. Deadpool smiled and gestured twice to Lin. Lin raised an eyebrow, and just as he was about to agree, he felt streams of positive mental energy flowing into his body. Was this the feedback from the patients he saved in the underground room? As these positive Mental energies flowed in, the seed within him, which had reached its critical point, developed cracks, and then crack. A crisp cracking sound echoed deep within Lin's mind. His consciousness seemed to hit a pause button, appearing in a state of chaos, or rather, he was this chaos. Primal, disordered, formless, nothing existed, yet everything seemed to exist. The next moment, Lin had an epiphany and murmured softly. Inner world, open. With a resounding blast from the depths of his soul, a miraculous space slowly emerged within his body. The inner world. This was Lin's exclusive world. In this world, Lin commanded everything. But it's too small. Lin's eye twitched. The commotion and grandeur of the inner world sprouting from that seed were completely disproportionate to the current space, which was only 10 meters in diameter. However, the inner world had just appeared. It had plenty of time to grow. No rush. A thought flashed through Lin's mind, and his consciousness abruptly returned to normal. He looked at Deadpool, who was still making his signature gestures at him, and his eyebrows subtly lifted. Although it felt like a long time to him, in reality, it was only an instant. You seem to have changed somehow. Deadpool looked at Lin with confusion, but he couldn't quite pinpoint what was different. I'll take care of them. Lin said with a smile. What? Deadpool was stunned, but then he saw Lin leap with force and actually fly. Ah! My god! Deadpool cupped his face and exclaimed, which generation of Superman is Lin? Is it a remake again? Flight. After the seed sprouted and officially transformed into the inner world within him, he had mastered this ability. And the appearance of the inner world didn't just allow Lin to fly. His body and soul were comprehensively enhanced under the blessing of the inner world, and as the inner world continued to grow, he would become increasingly stronger. A smile played on Lin's lips as he charged straight at the remaining Chidori soldiers. After deftly dodging several energy rays, he landed on a flying vehicle. His fingers were long and flawless, looking very pleasing to the eye, but he grabbed the Chidori soldier's head in an extremely brutal manner, then squeezed hard. Bang! It was like a blue-green tomato mixed with wires had been crushed. Lin frowned. As the flying vehicle lost control and plummeted to the ground, he threw the Chidori soldier's corpse at another Chidori soldier. Boom! The Chidori soldier was struck as if by a cannonball, flying away with the corpse. The next second, energy rays swept towards Lin. Lin arced through the air, dodging the Chidori's attack, and plunged into the Chidori flying squad. Boom! Boom! With several explosions, Lin passed through the fire and landed in front of Deadpool. He was completely unharmed. Deadpool excitedly shouted, "Are you Clark? I'm Bruce." Lin. A continuous stream of Chidori poured out of the portal onto Earth, then scattered. Wherever the Chidori passed, the area was immediately engulfed by energy beams, bringing with it a wave of fire and gore. If there were a real-time map of Manhattan, one would see the blood-red color representing the Chidori, centered around the portal, spreading rapidly outwards like crimson ink blooming in water. What terrified everyone in Manhattan even more were the Leviathan behemoths that passed through the spatial gate, one after another. Their massive bodies alone, simply moving through the city, brought about one disaster after another. As troop transports, they further scattered wave after wave of Chidori soldiers during their flight, continuously expanding the battlefield. Manhattan was being consumed by the flames of war. Lin looked at the distant pillar of light. That was the center of the battlefield, the place where the fighting was most intense, and also where the Avengers fought. At this moment, bolts of lightning were striking the area where the spatial gate was located. The violent electricity, like lightning snakes, blocked all invading Chidori outside the spatial gate. Below the pillar of light, explosions bloomed continuously like fireworks. Not far from the pillar of light, a roaring hulk was knocking a Leviathan out of the sky. As for the other three, well, they should also be working very hard. But Lin couldn't see them. Clearly, the protagonists of today's war were the Avengers. Lin's eyes flickered. Seeing Deadpool circling him like a curious cat, constantly sizing him up, he raised a hand and pressed it against Deadpool's face, pushing him aside. Stop looking at me, let's save people. Lin said emotionlessly. Although he had no intention of participating in the Avengers stage, he still wanted to harvest some positive, spiritual energy. As he finished speaking, before Deadpool could reply, Lin rushed into the chaotic crowd. In such desperate times, those rescued by Lin would provide very strong emotional feedback. This positive, spiritual energy continuously surged into Lin's inner world, causing the inner world to slowly expand, and as the inner world expanded, it would also feed back stronger power to Lin. This feeling of constantly growing stronger made Lin happy. As he was rapidly grinding experience, because he was eliminating more and more Chidori, he was marked as an increasing threat in the Chidori's neural network terminal. In response to this threat, several Chidori aerial squads from the invading Chidori army immediately broke off and flew towards Lin. Hawkeye stood on top of a building, and after seeing this unusual situation, a look of confusion flashed in his eyes. He immediately pressed his communicator and said, "Stark. Several Chidori squads are flying towards 58th Street. I know, Legolas. I'm going to intercept them now." Tony Stark, with his usual sarcastic tone, flew towards 58th Street with a serious expression. Thor needed to block the Chidori near the spatial gate. Banner had already transformed and wouldn't listen to commands, and the others were saving civilians below. Only he was the most flexible and capable of rapid support. Meanwhile, inside a jewelry store, a dozen people huddled together under a counter, fearfully watching two Chidori soldiers approaching them, their bodies trembling like sieves. Bang! A scorching white energy ray struck the counter, shattering it. Broken glass and jewelry rained down like a chaotic shower on the terrified crowd, and the weapons of the two Chidori soldiers were already emitting a deadly glow. Just as they were about to be turned into a pile of rotten flesh, Lin appeared behind the two Chidori soldiers with a fierce gust of wind. Before they could react, he pressed his hands on their heads and slammed them together. Bang! The heads of the two Chidori soldiers burst open like watermelons. Lin released his hands, and the two corpses fell to the ground like mud. "It's all right now, go hide quickly," Lin said calmly to the crowd. They then snapped out of their fear, their bodies slumping to the ground. "Thank you. Thank you. This is great. I survived. Are you a superhero?" Lin felt the emotional feedback from the crowd, and a sense of comfort washed over him. In this short amount of time, his inner world had actually expanded by nearly one-third of its space. Salvation in desperation would provide him with more positive, spiritual energy. Lin suddenly sighed. It's a pity that, creating a crisis and then solving it, doesn't seem to provide positive, spiritual energy feedback, otherwise he would immediately take off. Lin saw a flash of silver light rapidly flying towards him. So many Chidori. Lin's eyes narrowed, and he immediately flew outwards. The target of these Chidori was him. If he stayed here, these recently rescued people would be in trouble. Sure enough, as he moved, those Chidori also changed direction and pursued him. Lin's eyes were calm. Just as he was about to turn around and eliminate these Chidori, boom, boom. A continuous series of explosions erupted behind him. The pursuing Chidori were like a string of lit firecrackers, leaving a trail of flames behind Lin. Lin looked back. He saw a golden-red figure pass through the explosions and appear beside him. It was Iron Man Tony Stark. "Spectacular, isn't it?" Tony Stark said with a smile. Seeing Lin looking at him, he proudly said, "No need to thank me." Lin's eye twitched, and he calmly said, "Meddling." Tony Stark was stunned for a moment, then scoffed, "Buddy, I just helped you solve a problem, you." Before he could finish speaking, he saw a Leviathan swimming towards them, and Captain America's voice rang out in his communicator. "Stop that thing. Don't let them expand the battlefield any further." "Got it." Tony Stark responded, nodded at Lin, and then flew towards the Leviathan. Looking at the swimming behemoth, Tony Stark's expression was grim, but he didn't have much energy left, and the ammunition carried by his Iron Man suit was almost depleted, making it impossible to penetrate the Leviathan's sturdy armor. "So, Jarvis. Go through it." A hint of madness flashed in Tony Stark's eyes. Amidst Jarvis's dissuasions, he used himself as a weapon, shooting straight into the Leviathan's body. Boom, boom. Accompanied by a series of explosions, Tony Stark unleashed all his ammunition inside the Leviathan's body. Whoosh. Tony Stark passed through the Leviathan's shattered body and crashed down from midair. "Mr. Stark, the Iron Man suit's energy is almost depleted. Please disengage from the battlefield as soon as possible." Jarvis reminded Tony Stark, the inside of his mask glowing red, a signal that energy was about to run out. Tony Stark gasped violently. Just as he got up from the ground, he was hit by several energy rays. He staggered to steady himself, fired several repulsor blasts, sending away the surrounding Chitauri, and then controlled the Iron Man suit to fly up again. Just then, an anxious voice rang out in his communicator. Stark. A jet carrying a nuclear missile has flown past. How long until it hits? 3 minutes. Tony Stark didn't hesitate for a moment and immediately headed in the direction the nuclear missile was launched. These idiots. Tony Stark cursed under his breath, his eyes filled with rage. Just thinking about the consequences of a nuclear missile exploding in Manhattan made his heart clench. Found it. With Jarvis's help, Tony Stark saw the incoming nuclear missile and, without hesitation, pursued it. Just as his mind was racing, trying to figure out how to deal with this nuclear missile, his teammates brought him good news. Everyone, I can close the portal. Black Widow's charming voice brought relief to everyone. As long as the portal was closed, the enemy would have no way to transport troops, and this war would soon end. Wait. Tony Stark's eyes lit up as he found a way to deal with the nuclear missile. He then said to everyone, I have a nuclear missile here, and I'm going to send it through. Everyone was startled and hurriedly looked up at the sky. Seeing a streak of fire rapidly approaching, their hearts all tightened. It's almost over. Lynn looked at the nuclear missile flying towards Stark Tower. Noticing the golden red Iron Man below the nuclear missile, he subtly raised an eyebrow. Although this war was short, he had gained a lot of experience, and his inner world had expanded by a full half. And with the expansion of his inner world, his physical and spiritual strength had also undergone very significant changes. Most importantly, he felt something appearing within his inner world. But now was clearly not the time to check. What's going on? Lynn watched the nuclear missile heading straight for Stark Tower without any sign of turning, his eye twitching uncontrollably. No way. Such a ridiculous thing at the last moment. Lynn's expression was a little warped as he watched Tony Stark clinging tightly to the nuclear bomb, pressed against it. The Iron Man suit ran out of energy, unable to push the nuclear bomb to change direction. Is Tony Stark an idiot? Lynn couldn't help but curse under his breath, but a scene of Tony Stark helping him deal with the Chitauri suddenly flashed through his mind. Could it be, he couldn't have used up all his energy there, could he? Lynn's mouth twitched. But seeing the nuclear bomb getting closer and closer, Lynn still cursed and rushed towards it. At the same time, a look of despair had already appeared on Tony Stark's face. The Iron Man suit's energy was depleted. He had never thought this would happen. Although Jarvis repeatedly reminded him that the suit's energy was depleted, when the nuclear bomb struck, he still met it without hesitation. In his calculations, even if the suit's energy was close to depletion, there was still enough energy to send the nuclear bomb into the portal. But such precise calculations are prone to accidents, so when a Chitauri flying squad appeared on the nuclear bomb's flight path and attacked him, Tony had to expend some energy for defense. As a result, the Iron Man suit's energy was depleted ahead of time, and he was powerless to change the nuclear bomb's flight direction. Thor! Give me a hand! Tony Stark shouted anxiously. At this moment, only Thor could help him deliver the nuclear bomb. Thor heard Tony's shout and tried to stand up straight, but his legs gave out, and he almost fell to his knees. He had just expended too much power to seal the portal. Without a response from Thor, Tony Stark's heart sank to rock bottom, and the other Avengers also felt a chill. Seeing it getting closer and closer to Stark Tower, Tony Stark became more and more desperate, and couldn't help but shout into the communicator, "Close the portal. Run." Following his furious roar, Natasha, who had been waiting near the portal, immediately used the Mind Stone to close it. Watching the sky rapidly heal, Natasha slumped to the ground, leaning against the portal device. Run. There was no escape. At this point, it was best to wait for death. Too bad, there were still many things left undone. A look of regret flashed in Natasha's eyes. She pressed the communicator and slowly said to the Avengers, "Goodbye, everyone." Hearing this, everyone sighed with complex expressions, then became calm. Hawkeye gazed into the distance, as if bidding farewell to his wife and children far away. Captain America held up his shield, recalling his last dance promise with Carter, and sighed heavily. Tony Stark recorded a farewell message and sent it to Pepper Potts. Thor was trying to gather his strength, staring intently at the approaching nuclear bomb. He had not given up yet. As for Bruce Banner, he was still in the Hulk's enraged state and had no idea what was happening. Just as the Avengers' thoughts were scattered, and some had even prepared their last words in their hearts, a figure quietly appeared beside the nuclear bomb. It's him. What does he want to do? Tony Stark, hanging on the nuclear bomb, was stunned for a moment, and just as a thought flashed through his mind, he and the nuclear bomb vanished. The nuclear bomb disappeared. The Avengers were stunned for a moment, then a surge of ecstasy welled up in their hearts. Although they didn't yet know what had happened, the nuclear bomb crisis seemed to be resolved. But when the Avengers looked up at the sky again, the ecstasy of surviving a disaster quickly faded. Where is Stark? Who is this person? They looked at Lynn in midair, a look of confusion flashing in their eyes. Before they could think further, Lynn in midair disappeared. This was Lynn's first time using the inner world, and also his first time arriving in the inner world. But, the first time I used it, I brought in a nuclear bomb. Lynn's eye twitched uncontrollably. If this thing exploded in the inner world, his newly awakened inner world wouldn't be able to withstand it. Fortunately, this thing doesn't just explode randomly. Moreover, in the inner world, he could suppress it with the help of the inner world, for example, by slowing down the nuclear bomb's time flow by dozens of times for about half an hour. This was also why Lynn dared to bring the nuclear bomb in. He surveyed his inner world. It was only a dozen meters in size, surrounded by chaos, with no clear directions, no up or down, but he knew it was an incredibly real world. And this world was entirely within his grasp. Lynn pondered for a moment, a thought flashed through his mind, and the world before him changed accordingly. The chaotic inner world separated into heaven and earth. As a light-bulb-sized celestial body appeared in the inner world, a land made of sand and soil also appeared beneath Lynn's feet. Lynn looked up at the miniature sun that could be held in his hand and sighed helplessly. Achieving this much had consumed all of the positive mental energy in the inner world. However, he also experienced a feeling of creation, and this feeling was exhilarating. I need to deal with this thing quickly. Lynn looked at the nuclear bomb not far away, feeling his scalp tighten. The safest way was to find a safe place and throw the nuclear bomb out. This was his original idea. However, this was a nuclear bomb. Lynn narrowed his eyes, then looked at the unconscious Tony Stark, and a thought surfaced in his mind. Perhaps, he could ask Tony Stark for a small favor. Lynn muttered, stroking his chin, walked over to Tony Stark, lifted his faceplate, and gently patted his face. Hey, wake up. No reaction. Lynn thought for a moment, then suddenly whispered in Tony Stark's ear, Pepper Potts and Happy eloped. What? Tony Stark cried out, his eyes snapping open, then he began to breathe heavily. He was stunned for a moment, then said in shock, I'm still alive. But how did he just hear the whisper of a demon? Yes. Lynn replied, and with an arrogant expression, said to Tony Stark, I saved you, but no need to say thank you. Tony Stark listened to the familiar words, and after a moment of stunned, he couldn't help but laugh. Dude, you're so petty, but still, thank you. Tony lightly pressed a button on the side of his suit, and with a series of clicks, the suit peeled away from him, and he propped himself up to a sitting position. What is this place? A nuclear bomb. He saw the nuclear bomb behind Lynn, immediately lay back down, and frantically pulled the suit back onto himself. Lynn said calmly, I'm losing control. If you don't want to die, you'd better dismantle it quickly. You, control, nuclear bomb. Tony looked at Lynn in confusion, sat up from the ground again, and said discontentedly, I don't have any tools, and you want me to dismantle a nuclear bomb. Dismantle? It's a nuclear bomb. 10 minutes later, Tony, who had no tools at all, after removing some parts from the Iron Man suit, used those miscellaneous items to perform a live nuclear bomb dismantling in front of Lynn. Reset the detonation time. Change to timed detonation. Tony looked at the expressionless Lynn, his eyes flickered, and he said helplessly, Dude, I can't do that right now, it requires more parts. Lynn gave Tony a deep look, shrugged, and said, Then forget it. Tony secretly breathed a sigh of relief, then frowned. Why does this place look so strange? Just as he was looking around with a thoughtful expression, Lynn walked up to him and lifted him up. You can leave now. Lin said, and without waiting for Tony to speak, he threw him out of the inner world. Tony plummeted from high altitude, his curses torn into broken notes by the whistling air currents. He didn't want to splat into a puddle and make tomorrow's news. Seeing the ground getting closer and closer, the words from his mouth finally turned into help. Whoosh. Lin suddenly appeared beside him and caught him, his slender fingers clamping onto Tony's collar like iron pincers. Tony's limbs flailed comically in midair, like a cat being lifted by the scruff of its neck. Tony's face was pale, his head covered in cold sweat, and he gripped Lin's hand tightly, muttering incessantly, "Hey! You can't hold me like this, I feel like a pet. How about a different pose?" Lin's lips curled slightly, and he gave a gentle shake of his hand. Once Tony's mouth quieted down, he flew towards Stark Tower, holding him by his clothes. Seconds later, he brought Tony to the top floor of Stark Tower. At this moment, the Avengers were silently cleaning up the battlefield on the top floor, but when Lin flew in, the weary Avengers still looked over with vigilance. Thud. Lin released Tony, and Tony landed on the ground face first. Several Avengers were stunned. Ha! Ha! Tony laughed awkwardly, scrambled to his feet, and waved to everyone. Everyone, no need to hold a memorial service for me. The others exchanged glances, while Black Widow smiled and gave Tony a hug. Welcome back. Everyone smiled and nodded at Tony, then looked at Lin beside him. He saved me, his name is. Tony paused, realizing he didn't know Lin's name yet. Facing the confused gazes of the crowd, Lin said indifferently, Lin Crete. Everyone immediately cast grateful looks at Lin. Lin not only saved Tony, but also them, and countless ordinary citizens. Just then, Loki, who was huddled in a corner, saw that no one seemed to be paying attention to him, and a sly glint flashed in his eyes. But as soon as he moved his foot, the Avengers suddenly turned their heads to look at him, their eyes all icy. Loki immediately raised his hands and stood still with an obedient smile. The Avengers snorted coldly, and just as they were about to thank Lin, Lin suddenly turned and flew away. Wait! My bat! Watching Lin fly away, Tony called out, but Lin vanished in the blink of an eye. His expression stiffened, and he suddenly looked with disgust at Loki nearby. It must be because you, reindeer, are too ugly. Loki. After Lin left Stark Tower at top speed, he found an uninhabited place and entered the inner world. While the Avengers were expressing their gratitude, he received a considerable amount of positive, spiritual energy. At this time, these positive, spiritual energies, upon appearing in the inner world, transformed into pure power of faith. This was something that had never happened before. Power of faith. When the inner world first opened, and even before he first entered the inner world, these positive, spiritual energies did not transform into the power of faith. The reason he hastily left Stark Tower was because he noticed that the power of faith was turning into nutrients, nurturing something within the inner world. That something had reached its final stage and would appear with just a little more power of faith. Lin closed his eyes, sensing the feedback of information from the inner world. A moment later, he suddenly opened his eyes, which were filled with disbelief. The thing being nurtured was the inner world's own power system. Power system. What is that? Lin paused, then closed his eyes to carefully sense it. A moment later, his expression became strange. He had originally thought the inner world was just a portable realm where he could store things and it would empower him, but after its appearance, it would even nurture a power system. However, this nurturing process was a bit of a scam. Based on my cognition, memories, and experiences, randomly select one as the object, then use the power of faith to rationalize and complete it. It sounded reasonable, but it was completely unreliable. What did random mean? Did it know what was in his head? How dare it be random? Lin just recalled some profound memories in his mind, and his face instantly darkened. Abstract videos, games, anime, tokusatsu dramas, and numbered educational films. If it randomly selected a certain numbered film and rationalized that thing, making it the power system nurtured by the inner world, he would just keel over and die right here. Fortunately, it still required a lot of power of faith to complete the final nurturing. Perhaps during this time, he could communicate with the inner world daily and try his best to guide the direction of the nurturing. Lin glanced at the empty inner world. He needed to arrange this place properly. A thought flashed through his mind, and he turned and left the inner world, flying towards his clinic. Lin flew high above, looking at the traces of war below, his eyes flickering. This sudden war was a nightmare for the people of New York. Fortunately, the war did not last long, otherwise, casualties would have increased exponentially. But even so, the sounds of crying and screaming echoed throughout Manhattan. Lin landed near his clinic. Hey, Lin baby. Over here. Deadpool's red suit was particularly conspicuous on the rubble pile. He swung a stethoscope he'd picked up from the ruins, waving it at Lin. After noticing Lin's gaze, he pointed to the clinic's remains. Lin quickly walked over. As Deadpool, holding the stethoscope, pressed it against his chest with an extremely lewd laugh, Lin punched him in the face. Get lost and go be a pervert somewhere else. Oh. Deadpool let out an ecstatic cry and brought his face close to Lin's. Please, baby. Do it here too. Scram. Lin pushed Deadpool's face away. After Deadpool skipped off with a playful grin, Lin looked at the ruins in front of him and couldn't help but mutter to himself, I hope Mrs. Crete had insurance. He identified the location of the underground warehouse in the ruins. Seeing that the clinic's underground warehouse showed no signs of damage, he breathed a sigh of relief. Lin spent some time clearing away the building debris, then pulled open the warped warehouse door. Sunlight fell on him, outlining a dazzling silhouette, and then squeezed into the dark warehouse, bringing a patch of light. When the people inside the warehouse saw Lin at the door, the fear in their hearts largely dissipated. It's all right, it's over, you can come out now. Lin said to the crowd. Everyone rushed out excitedly, but when they saw the city, broken as if in an apocalypse, they couldn't help but freeze. Was this still the Manhattan they remembered? It's terrifying. May Parker said, her voice trembling, then she said to Lin, thank you, Lin. If it weren't for Lin, whether they would even be alive now was a question. The patients all looked at Lin gratefully, earning Lin a small wave of power of faith. Seeing that everyone was still standing there in a daze, Lin couldn't help but remind them, aren't you going home to check first? Peter. May Parker cried out in surprise and was the first to run home. The others also changed their expressions and rushed home. These people's nerves are too thick. Did they take too many painkillers? Lin couldn't help but complain, and just as he was about to go brush up on some experience points, his phone rang. The call connected, and a deep voice sounded. Lin, where are you? Are you okay? Mike Crete, Lin's father after he transmigrated to this world, is currently the director of the New York Police Department and is preparing for retirement. I'm fine, I'm good. Lin replied, and remembering the inner world that appeared, he said with some hesitation, but I seem to have awakened a mew. We'll talk about it when you get home tonight. Mike Crete interrupted Lin and said in a deep voice, don't forget to tell your mother you're safe. Okay. Lin responded, and after hanging up the phone, he dialed a series of numbers. The phone rang several times before a lazy voice slowly sounded. My darling, what's wrong? New York. I know, the aliens invaded. It should be fine now, right? Freya Crete's voice was still full of laziness, as if what happened in New York didn't bother her at all. It's fine now, just a bit chaotic. That's good. I'll call you later. I'm shopping with my best friend. Freya Crete hastily hung up the phone, but before she did, Lin heard a piercing scream. Lin's face darkened. Shopping. Buying other people's lives. Lin put away his phone, looked at the collapsed buildings, listened to the faint screams in his ears, and with a serious expression, rushed into this battlefield, a battlefield for ordinary people. The next day, as the first ray of morning sun fell on Lin, he, who had been engrossed in post-war emergency rescue, finally let out a long breath and wearily rubbed his temples. Although this sudden war did not last long, the casualties it caused were far more severe than imagined. The injured filled every hospital, but even so, many injured people could not receive timely treatment. Not only because there were too many injured people, but also because the efficiency was too poor. Some hospitals even considered whether the injured person had health insurance first when faced with these patients, and some even asked if they had an appointment. Even after living in this world for 19 years, Lin still couldn't understand these strange ways of thinking. Fortunately, after a night of busy work, most of the seriously injured patients basically received treatment, and Lin also gained a lot of power of faith during the emergency rescue. Lin remembered his agreement with his father and rushed home. Fortunately, the building where their apartment was located only suffered slightly soiled skirt damage in this war. Tisk, that saves us the trouble of moving. Lin chuckled as he opened the door, and seeing the breakfast on the dining table, a warm current slowly flowed in his heart. You're back. You didn't rest all night. Go wash up first. Hearing the movement, Mike Crete poked his head out of the kitchen, a smile appearing on his serious and chiseled face. Okay. Lin responded, and after taking a shower, he sat at the dining table. When he bit into the still warm fried egg, he immediately transformed into a hungry ghost, finishing a portion of breakfast in a few bites. He hadn't eaten anything for a day. Eat slowly. Mike Crete smiled and handed Lin a glass of milk, then casually pushed his own breakfast in front of Lin, his expression completely at odds with his serious and dignified features. Lin couldn't help but laugh. Dad, can you not look at me like that? It feels like you're looking at a child. Since his birth, his father had never been absent from his growth, and even paid more attention to him than his mother, Freya. Compared to my long life, you are indeed still just a baby. Mike Crete still looked at Lin with a smile. Lin was stunned for a moment, then chuckled, right, a long 46 years. The smile on Mike Crete's face disappeared, and he said seriously, no, it's thousands of years, or perhaps even longer. Old man, did the aliens mess up your head? Lin smiled and touched his father's forehead. Mike Crete slapped Lin's hand away with a cold expression. Be serious. Lin looked at his father's expression, and his heart tightened. Okay. From what he knew of his father, he was definitely not joking now, but thousands of years. As soon as he thought of this terrifying number, Lin suddenly had a bad premonition. Yesterday on the phone, you wanted to say that you awakened mutant abilities. Mike Crete looked at Lin playfully. Lin nodded and said, yes. His mother, Freya, was a mutant, so he naturally had a chance to awaken mutant abilities. What if I told you that it's not just your mutant abilities, but also your talent and responsibilities as a god? A hint of playfulness appeared on Mike Crete's face, and he eagerly awaited his son's reaction. God. Lin mumbled, looking at his father with shock and confusion, feeling that this world had become unfamiliar. Ha ha. Mike Crete was very satisfied with Lin's expression, then looked at Lin with utmost seriousness. Lin Crete, my son, today I must confess my identity to you. He paused, and in his deep voice, it seemed as if thunder was roaring. I am the king of the gods, Zeus. Lin blinked, carefully scrutinizing his father. Time had left a touch of white on his temples, under his neat short hair were light blue eyes, he was tall and robust, with chiseled features, and a neatly trimmed beard. He didn't resemble the greasy Zeus from the original plot in the slightest. Old man, stop joking. Zeus. You don't look like him at all. Mike Crete, no, it was Zeus. Zeus looked at Lin in confusion and slowly asked, you know what Zeus looks like? Lin closed his mouth. He couldn't very well say he'd seen him in the plot, could he? He was silent for a few seconds, then asked curiously, if you are Zeus, why are you here? Zeus should be in the pantheon, right? Why would he be on Earth? Hearing this question, Zeus said calmly, because my authority was taken, I lost my power, and I was exiled to Earth. Lin was stunned for a moment, then nodded. If Odin could have his memory erased by Loki and be exiled to Earth, Zeus having a similar experience to Odin was not unacceptable. Lin was curious about how Zeus, as the king of the gods, had his authority and power taken away. However, his father didn't explain, and he had no intention of pressing the matter. And Zeus clearly didn't want to recall this unpleasant past of his now. Zeus stroked Lin's head, gently tapping the back of his head. Lin, you've awakened your talent now, and Olympus will soon notice. I must warn you. Warn him about what? Lin had a bad feeling. Their foreheads pressed together, Zeus gazed into Lin's eyes, a smile flickering in his own, but his tone grew serious. Beware of Hera, Poseidon, Ares, Apollo, Athena. Lin was stunned. Listening to his old man rattle off a string of names, images of some people flashed in his mind. Realizing these family members might be his future enemies, his mouth twitched, and he tried to pull his forehead away from his father's. But Zeus held his head firmly, looking at Lin gently, and asked, "Did you remember?" You. Lin looked at Zeus speechlessly. "Do you want me to die?" Zeus chuckled, but Lin suddenly asked, "You're becoming Mike Crete, is it related to one or more of them?" Zeus released his hand, a complex emotion flashing in his eyes before returning to that unfathomable calm. He slowly said, "You'll know in the future." Lin shrugged, then suddenly scrutinized Zeus with a strange look, a gossipy curve forming on his lips. "So, how many lovers and children do you actually have? Do you really not even spare animals? How could that be?" Zeus's face instantly flushed red, as if struck by lightning, and he roared in anger. "That's a rumor. A rumor spread by those idiots to tarnish my name. It's human conjecture. How could I possibly like animals?" It was the first time Lin had seen his father lose his composure, and he couldn't help but raise an eyebrow, which means you really do have a lot of lovers and children. Ahem. Zeus cleared his throat, somewhat unnaturally averting his gaze. "I've lived too long." Lin pouted, leaning back in his chair, which let out a slight creak. He casually tossed out a question, "Does my mom know? She found out after you were born." Zeus gave an awkward smile, then became serious. "But here, I am only Mike Crete." Even now, he remembered every detail of that day, remembered Freya's changing expression after she learned he was Zeus. Lin nodded. Since she knew, it was fine. Any problems were between his parents. He lowered his head in thought for a while, his fingertips unconsciously tapping the table, making faint sounds, various thoughts flashing through his mind. After I awaken my talent, Olympus will know very quickly. How quickly is, very quickly. Zeus was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed out the window, as if piercing through layers of space to see the divine realm of Olympus. After you awaken, your authority will condense into a star, appearing in the sky of Olympus. His voice was deep and grave, and this condensation time will take at least a month. At this point, an apologetic look appeared on Zeus's face. "I'm sorry, son. I should have told you earlier, to give you more time to prepare for Olympus." Lin pressed his temples, a headache forming. In other words, he had to grow strong enough to resist an attack from Olympus within this month. "You don't have to worry too much." Zeus gently patted Lin's shoulder, comforting him. "According to ancient covenants, Olympus cannot send many gods to Earth, and besides." He paused, stroking the stubble on his chin, and slowly said, "It doesn't necessarily mean there will be a conflict." Lin raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "It depends on who comes to Earth." Zeus smiled slightly, though unseen lightning seemed to flicker in his eyes. "Don't worry, I won't let anything happen to you." Lin was startled, then he also smiled. "Have a little faith in me. Don't I still have time?" "Ha ha." Zeus laughed heartily, his laughter echoing in the living room. "You truly are my son." He patted Lin's shoulder, stood up, and picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, walking towards the door while grumbling softly. "Those aliens really picked their timing, they've forced me to delay my retirement plans." Lin was stunned for a moment, then shook his head with a smile. "Indeed, the only one who likes to work is that yellow sponge." After watching his father leave, Lin sat alone at the dining table, his fingers gently tapping the surface. Son of Zeus. Lin felt nothing for this title, one could even say he had no good feelings about it. Especially after he thought about the stories among the gods of Olympus, his temples throbbed even more. It seems even more melodramatic than Asgard. He gave a wry smile, feeling his mind in a chaotic mess of thoughts, unable to think calmly. Although he had always appeared calm and composed in front of Zeus, only he knew how much impact the fact that father suddenly became Zeus had on him. Things are so troublesome. Lin sighed softly, rubbing his temples. "I'll sleep first, then we'll talk." He needed to reboot his mind and regain his composure. After taking some time to clean up the dishes, Lin returned to his bedroom and fell asleep. Meanwhile, this city, which had just experienced war, after a night of buffer, burst forth with astonishing fervor. This was the first city to be invaded by aliens. And it was a city that defeated the aliens. In news reports, New York was even called the City of Heroes. Although the war brought considerable casualties and sorrow, repelling the aliens was even more worth celebrating. They needed a carnival to dilute the lingering fear and sadness. So, those who were sad remained sad, while those unaffected had already plunged into the celebratory carnival of this city of heroes. Since it was called the City of Heroes, the Avengers, who were active in this alien invasion and even repelled it, naturally became the focus of New York and the entire world, becoming the most prominent heroes. In just one night, the Avengers gained countless followers. Stark Tower. As the epicenter of this war, Stark Tower received much attention, especially since it was Iron Man's home. Early in the morning, a large number of media gathered around Stark Tower, hoping to get some explosive news. Fortunately, these media encountered Tony, who was returning to Stark Tower to pick up some things. When Tony appeared in front of the building, the news media swarmed him like sharks smelling blood. After all, what interview could be more explosive than interviewing a superhero who participated in the war? Noting the frenzy of the reporters, even the battle-hardened Tony couldn't help but feel his scalp tingle. Mr. Stark, what are your thoughts on yesterday's war? Will they come again? What actions will the Avengers take in the near future? Mr. Stark, just say a few words. Iron Man, may I ask? Tony faced the barrage of reporters, cameras, giving perfunctory answers to some irrelevant questions, carrying a briefcase as he walked towards his car parked on the side of the road. Just then, Mr. Stark, it is rumored that the military launched a nuclear bomb at Manhattan yesterday. Is this true? Hearing this question, Tony's steps faltered, and he stopped in place. He looked at the reporter who asked the question, and slowly nodded, yes. Everyone fell silent, but Tony continued, Lynn stopped the nuclear bomb from exploding. Everyone who survived the nuclear attack should thank Lynn. Lynn, who was in a deep sleep, slowly opened his eyes, a flicker of confusion in them, and he abruptly sat up from the bed. He cursed softly, his eyes filled with shock. How had the power system nurtured by the inner world been completed? He clearly remembered it was still short of a lot of faith, so what had happened in the few hours he was asleep? What exactly had the inner world nurtured? A cold sweat broke out on Lin's forehead. Although as the inner world continuously expanded, he would also become stronger due to the inner world's blessing, a proper power system was crucial for his future plans. I hope it's nothing strange. Lin felt a little uneasy. He should have known better than to fill his head with so much random stuff. Would he have to use a move called Yamate to make his enemies stop when facing them later? His enemies would probably get even more excited. Hiss. Lin gasped, feeling as if his recently rebooted brain had become even more muddled. Regardless, he had to see what it was. A thought flashed through Lin's mind, and with a flicker, he plunged into his inner world. Is this still my inner world? Lin looked at the inner world, which had expanded at least tenfold, and the confusion in his eyes grew thicker. So, what exactly had happened in the few hours he was sleeping? After another question mark appeared in Lin's mind, he slowly closed his eyes and began to sense the current inner world. After the inner world expanded, his strength also significantly increased. Lin clenched his fist, flew a circle around the inner world at an extremely fast speed, and after feeling his current strength, a look of pleasant surprise flashed in his eyes. My strength and speed have doubled. Lin murmured, unable to resist clenching his fist and swinging it. Bang! The air seemed to explode, emitting a loud bang. Lin's lips curled up. This feeling of increasing power was truly captivating, especially with the inner world completely under his control, which gave him a sense of omnipotence. What surprised Lin was that at this moment, faith was still continuously pouring into the inner world. Lin pondered for a moment, then slowly closed his eyes. The faith began to be consumed, and the inner world also began to change according to Lin's thoughts. The land beneath Lin's feet began to spread, until it occupied the entire inner world. Immediately after, a clump of green grass appeared beneath Lin's feet, then quickly spread to the horizon like a green carpet being unfurled. In an instant, the desolate inner world gained some vitality. Just as the miniature sun in the inner world grew slightly larger, a lake with a diameter of over 10 meters appeared in the center of the inner world. To call it a lake might be inaccurate. Because it was too small, it was more like a large pond, and there wasn't a single drop of water in it. With a thought from Lin, the faith continuously flowing into the inner world was drawn into the small lake. A moment later, some clear lake water appeared out of thin air at the bottom of the small lake, and as time passed, the lake water in the small lake continued to slowly increase. This lake water was the materialized form of faith, and this was where Lin stored his faith. According to Lin's vision, as the faith increased, this small lake would eventually be filled with faith, and the small lake would also grow larger and larger, eventually becoming a true lake of faith. The reason he did this was because he discovered that after faith was absorbed into the inner world, if it wasn't constrained and managed, the faith would be instinctively devoured by the inner world to expand its space. And for Lin, faith was not just for expanding the inner world. Remaking the inner world, which meant creating or transforming into something, all required the consumption of faith. Like the land, grass, and the miniature sun hanging in the sky that had just appeared. Creation. No, it's still somewhat different from creation. Lin murmured, shaking his head. These things appeared by his will, consuming faith, without any process of creation. They simply appeared according to Lin's thoughts and changed accordingly. It's more like a materialized creation, or what immortal hero novels call, a thought brings forth myriad things. Lin mumbled, stroking his chin, and a thought suddenly surged in his mind that made his heart pound. Creating conscious life. A moment later, after several attempts, Lin's eyebrows subtly twitched. It really doesn't work. And not only conscious life couldn't be created, even man-made objects couldn't be created. Was the inner world's current level too low, or was it fundamentally impossible to create? It's impossible to verify now. Lin muttered, pushing the thought to the back of his mind, then sat down, closed his eyes, and began to communicate with the inner world to check the power system it had nurtured. Although he was somewhat afraid of what abstract things might be nurtured, he had to face it eventually. And when he connected his consciousness with the inner world, he sank into a darkness. Then, he heard the sound of this world, a sound that beat with his heart. Thump, thump. Something seemed to be appearing in this dark world. This was the pulse of the universe, this was the primordial sound. A realization dawned in Lin's heart. The next instant, the sound, like a beating heart, grew stronger and stronger, and when it reached its peak, the sound abruptly paused. It was as if this darkness had contracted into itself. Bang! Accompanied by the sudden initial explosion, a myriad of mottled and brilliant colors filled Lin's entire world. Those were stars, those were galaxies formed by countless stars, it was the magnificent and brilliant starry universe, it was the cosmos within Lin's body. He abruptly opened his eyes, as if fire was burning within them. The next instant, the cosmos within his body also began to rotate, until an ineffably powerful force surged into his body. Flames like exploding stars scorched every inch of his body, as if crushing his body to dust. But the next instant, his flesh and blood were reborn in the flames of the cosmos. A moment later, when the flames in Lin's eyes dissipated, a smile finally appeared on his face. The Saint's Cosmo power system. Although he most wanted a power system like the primordial era, he was already very satisfied with randomly getting the Cosmo. After all, it was much better than something like Balala the fairies or Yamate. Moreover, as the son of Zeus, awakening the Cosmo power system was simply too reasonable. Unfortunately, the level and power of the Cosmo are limited by the inner world, and it cannot exert its true power yet. Lin shook his head, somewhat helplessly. However, this was to be expected. After all, the Cosmo power system was something nurtured by the inner world, so it would naturally be influenced by the inner world. But the good news is that as the inner world grows, my Cosmo will also strengthen accordingly, even without cultivation. Lin's lips curled slightly, and the jumbled thoughts that had appeared before he went to sleep because of Olympus, all vanished into thin air after the awakening of the Cosmo. In the end, only one thought appeared in his mind. Do it. Do it. When Lin emerged from his inner world, the sky had already completely darkened. Lin stretched his body, feeling the surging power within him, and a sense of comfort washed over him. With the blessings of the inner world and the power of his Cosmo, Lin's strength had taken another leap compared to the day before. However, what Lin found regrettable was that his Cosmo, due to the inner world's limitations, was still in the realm of the fifth sense and had not broken through to the sixth sense. And breaking through to the sixth sense was when Cosmo truly unleashed its power. Even if I reach the sixth sense, with the current level of my inner world, I wouldn't be able to unleash much power, would I? Lin murmured, understanding dawning in his mind. Only when the inner world's level was high enough could the power system born from it fully exert its strength. Ultimately, the inner world was Lin's foundation. The good news was that as the master of the inner world, when its level increased, his Cosmo realm would also rise accordingly. Besides that, what Lin was most satisfied with was that he could teach others to cultivate Cosmo. In other words, could he train my own saints? Lin murmured, a strange look on his face. A son of Zeus training saints. How did that feel increasingly logical? Lin chuckled involuntarily, then turned to look out the window. As night deepened, the steadily brightening lights quickly illuminated the city, resembling a brilliant galaxy. Although it had endured a great battle, the city remained dazzling, at least, on the surface. His gaze seemed to pierce through the dazzling river of stars, settling on the dark corners of the city. This was the perfect time to verify the speed of faith power acquisition after his strength increase, and to conduct a simple test of his current power. In less than 2 days, his strength had made 2 leaps, making him unsure of his own power. A thought flashed through Lin's mind. He picked up his phone, changed into a black tracksuit, opened the window, and leapt out. Lin spread his arms, his black tracksuit flapping wildly as he plummeted. But when he was still several meters from the ground, his body suddenly hovered, the airflow bursting outwards like ripples, and then he shot straight into the sky. Woohoo! He cheered, enjoying the thrill of flight. After gaining the ability to fly with the birth of his inner world, he immediately joined the battle against the Chidori, with no time to enjoy the pleasure flight brought him. Now, flying just for the sake of flying, the joy came instantly. After Cosmo awakened, my speed increased again. The night was as dark as ink, and the silence above the clouds was broken by a sonic boom tearing through the air. Lin, accompanied by the sonic boom, darted through the clouds, tearing a white streak through them like an arrow, then he hovered above the clouds. I definitely broke the sound barrier, but a more accurate value can't be estimated by feeling alone. He muttered, pinching his chin, then landed on the rooftop of a tall building and released his 5 senses. Immediately, the cacophony from the ground flooded his ears. He frowned, a little uncomfortable. At this moment, he finally somewhat experienced Superman's pain. Although it certainly couldn't compare to Superman's exaggerated hearing, even this made his head feel like it was tearing apart. Focus on what interests you, block out irrelevant noise. Lin recalled how Superman trained his hearing. After calming himself down, he continuously adjusted his state, quickly familiarizing himself with his current 5 senses. A moment later, Lin exhaled deeply, a smile appearing on his face. It was largely resolved. It had to be said, the saints set up for cultivating Cosmo was abnormal. Their bodies and minds, honed to the extreme, learned combat techniques and mastered their bodies at an astonishing speed. Even though he was currently just a grunt, who hadn't awakened his 6th sense. There are many targets below, quite a few people are taking advantage of the chaos. Lin narrowed his eyes slightly, looking at the brightly lit city below. The impact of the Chidori invasion would continue for some time. This city had only superficially returned to peace. And those looking to profit from the chaos were not just those eyeing the Chidori legacy, but also thugs targeting ordinary people. You're the one. Lin selected a lucky one, and quickly flew towards him. Hand over your money. The thug growled ferociously, his gun pointed at a family of 3. Judging by the family's attire, they were definitely 3 fat sheep. It was only because Manhattan was more chaotic than ever that he, a petty thug from Brooklyn, dared to come here to make a fortune. But after this score, he should be able to rest for a few days. Okay, we'll give it to you. You must stay calm. The man comforted the thug a short distance away, clearly having extensive experience being robbed. Meanwhile, the woman held her child tightly, gently soothing him. Seeing the family of 3 so cooperative, the thug also quietly breathed a sigh of relief. The man took off his wallet and watch, placed them on the ground, then raised his hands and stepped back 2 paces. An excited look appeared on the thug's face as he rushed to the wallet. He opened the wallet, glanced inside, a look of pleasant surprise flashing in his eyes. He took out the money, stuffed it and the watch into his pocket, then casually tossed the wallet at his feet. He looked at the family of 3 nearby. Seeing them obediently standing still, the worry and fear in his eyes completely vanished, replaced by almost tangible greed. Noticing the thug's change, the man's heart sank. But the next instant, he saw a figure in a black tracksuit hood, descending like a phantom from the sky, silently appearing behind the thug, and a look of astonishment flashed across his face. Ah! His son also saw the scene and let out a frightened scream. The thug froze, then pointed his gun at the family of three and angrily shouted, "Quiet! You idiots! Buddy, you're the idiot, aren't you? That wallet is worth a lot more than that cash." An unfamiliar voice echoed faintly behind the thug. The thug shivered, a ferocious look appearing in his eyes. He turned and fired without hesitation. Bang! A piercing gunshot rang out in the alley, and the family of three nearby trembled in fear. Lin felt a pang of pain in his chest and subtly raised an eyebrow. He could withstand ordinary bullet shots relatively easily, but if unnecessary, it was best not to take them with his body. A thought flashed through his mind. Just as the thug's finger was about to pull the trigger, Lin slapped the thug across the face. Instantly, the thug flew up and spun like a top, crashing heavily against the alley wall. Watching this scene, the family of three was even more terrified, not daring to move. "It's all right now, hurry and go." Lin's voice was gentle as he comforted the family of three. The family breathed a sigh of relief. As they walked past Lin, hugging the wall, Lin suddenly asked, "What's your child's name?" The family of three shivered and immediately stood still. The man swallowed, a little nervously, "Pluto." "Oh, it's nothing. Let's go." Lin waved his hand. After the family of three left, he smiled and shook his head. This extremely familiar scene made him suspect it was the Bat family. Just then, he felt the power of faith provided by the family of three flow like fine sand into his inner world, so thin it was almost imperceptible. So little. Not even enough to fill a tooth gap. Lin frowned slightly. In that case, this street hero, even a dog wouldn't do it. Even with his current strength, working all night and resolving a dozen such incidents would provide very limited help to the growth of his inner world through the power of faith. Tonight's test was complete, and Lin had reached a conclusion. "I need to find other ways to obtain the power of faith." Lin mused, shaking his head with a low laugh. "It's a pity my career as a street hero ended before it even began." Before he finished speaking, Lin disappeared from the spot. A moment later, Lin, after dealing with two thugs along the way and gaining some meager power of faith, bought himself dinner and returned home. He habitually took a cool shower, changed his clothes, and then sat down in front of his computer with his dinner. Lin held a hamburger in one hand and typed rapidly on the computer with the other, searching for stories of Olympus. Zeus transforming into golden rain to have affairs with mortals, Hera turning her rivals into cows. He took a bite of his hamburger and couldn't help but chuckle. If these gods were around today, they'd be trending for a whole year. There were many gods on Olympus, and those Zeus reminded him of were only a fraction. Before the people of Olympus appeared before him, he felt that everyone could be his enemy. Just as he was risking his worldview being shattered by reading the melodramatic stories of the Olympian gods, some news popped up on his computer. Lin looked at the news, a look of surprise flashing across his face. "We should all thank Lin. Lin is, me. This must be the reason for the surge in the power of faith in his inner world." From the moment Lin woke up until now, his inner world had not only expanded tenfold, but the power of faith was also continuously increasing, and the water of the lake of faith was growing. And the situation of the lake of faith's water continuously increasing should continue for some time. Lin hastily opened the news report. Tony Stark. Looking at Tony Stark's interview photo, all of Lin's doubts vanished. After Tony Stark revealed that he had stopped the nuclear bomb explosion, he became the object of everyone's gratitude, and thus the power of faith surged in a short period. "This guy inadvertently really helped me a lot." Lin raised an eyebrow. Although what Tony Stark said was true, besides this arrogant genius, other Avengers and informed individuals probably wouldn't reveal the nuclear bomb incident, right? After all, this matter had too great an impact. Although it was the best choice under the circumstances, those within the nuclear blast's influence wouldn't think that way. If they had truly died in the nuclear explosion, they would naturally have become innocent victims of the alien invasion, a cold statistic to be commemorated by people. But the current situation was that the aliens had been driven off Earth, and the nuclear explosion had been prevented by Lin and Tony Stark. These people, who were highly likely to have died in the nuclear explosion, survived. Therefore, While they were grateful for what Lynn and Tony Stark had done, they naturally felt anger and dissatisfaction towards the government and the military. And it was considerable dissatisfaction. Lynn looked at the various comments under the news report and couldn't help but chuckle. Calling the government pigs, saying the military only wasted taxpayers' money, saying both the military and the government should go to hell, the insults are so weak. They should go to the internet forums of the East to learn. Lynn muttered softly, and after reading some comments praising Lynn, for a while, he happily turned off his computer. After his inner world had nurtured the Cosmo power system, Lynn, possessing the power of Cosmo and the blessing of his inner world, felt no fear towards the incoming people from Olympus. Just as his father said, Olympus couldn't send a large number of gods to Earth, and even if they did, a conflict might not necessarily occur. Under these circumstances, Lynn was still confident he could handle it, not to mention having his inner world as a backup. Moreover, even if he couldn't handle it, he had other methods. For example, joining the Avengers and asking the Avengers for help. Thinking this way, Lynn's psychological burden regarding the arrival of people from Olympus was greatly reduced. Now, Lynn was more concerned about the information brought by this surge in faith. After the inner world opened, the biggest difference from before was the range of faith collection. Before awakening, he could only collect positive mental energy when he explicitly knew he had done something, and had had face-to-face contact. It could be said to be quite arduous. Now, even deeds spread by others, when they aroused positive mental energy in others, Lynn's inner world could still collect the power of faith. For example, this nuclear bomb incident. Is it because after the inner world opened, positive mental energy transforms into the power of faith? Speaking of faith, Lynn naturally thought of various religions, and gods and believers. Lynn murmured, a thoughtful expression on his face. When a god becomes the faith itself, those believers will act in the name of the god and sing praises of the god's deeds, continuously providing the power of faith, even if the god actually did nothing. He mused, slowly closing his eyes, and once again meticulously felt the changes in his inner world, and the foundation of his inner world, the power of faith. Several hours later, Lynn slowly opened his eyes, feeling his entire mind suddenly clear. He needed believers. Believers could continuously provide him with the power of faith. Believers could spread his deeds and expand his influence. The actions of believers could better represent him and help him gain the power of faith. He needed believers. As a son of Zeus, it's only right to have some believers, isn't it? Lynn murmured, but couldn't help but let out a low laugh. He was growing more and more accustomed to his identity as a son of Zeus. So, how to develop believers? Inner world and Cosmo. Lynn exclaimed softly, a peculiar light flashing in his eyes. Since he could teach others Cosmo and cultivate his own saints, then the saints naturally had to be his believers, right? After becoming a saint, collecting the power of faith for him, that should also be right, shouldn't it? Everything was just right. A thought flashed through Lynn's mind, but his expression was a little strange. Olympus, son of Zeus, Cosmo, saint, it's getting more and more interesting. Lynn let out a low laugh. When the morning light passed through the window and fell on his face, he still maintained his contemplative posture, the sunlight gilding his outline, giving him a somewhat sacred aura. Who is suitable to be my first believer? Lynn mused, a thoughtful look flashing in his eyes, as names passed through his mind one by one. After a while, before he could decide on a candidate, his phone suddenly rang. Lynn looked at the unfamiliar number and answered the call with a puzzled expression. Hey, is this Lynn? I'm Tony Stark. In front of the ruins of Crete Clinic. A sleek, silver-gray sports car was parked in front of the clinic's ruins, looking like it had stumbled into a world it didn't belong to. Inside the car, Tony Stark leaned back in his seat, feigning sleep, while Jarvis thoughtfully turned off Tony's preferred aggressive metal music, replacing it with something light and soft. The Battle of New York had ended 2 days ago. Without a doubt, the Avengers had become heroes in everyone's eyes, the strongest shield against alien forces. But this trust and adoration brought the Avengers not just glory, but an indescribable responsibility and burden. Tony Stark wasn't sure how the other Avengers felt, but he felt like the weight was suffocating him. As soon as he closed his eyes, the grotesque Chitauri would appear before him. They stopped the alien invasion this time, but what about next time? What if an even stronger enemy appeared? Death, fire, burning cities, these images clung to him like an unshakable nightmare, preventing him from getting any proper rest. Jarvis diagnosed him with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and advised him to temporarily set aside work and rest. Tony readily accepted Jarvis's suggestion. Although he didn't think he needed rest, he felt he should go see Lynn. After all, his damaged Iron Man suit was still with Lynn. Tony found an excuse to rest, but to his surprise, he fell asleep in the car. As he gradually drifted from feigned sleep into a deeper slumber, the images that tormented him subtly resurfaced in his mind. Cities burning in fire, corpses wailing in their final moments, and a monster, enveloped by a blurry shadow, dragging him into the abyss. Thump. Thump. A crisp knocking sound broke the shadow engulfing him, pulling him out of the terrifying dream. Tony gasped for breath, the fear in his eyes still lingering. He frantically searched for the source of the sound, only to see Lynn standing by the car window. He froze for a moment, a look of disorientation flashing in his eyes. He took a deep breath, fully waking from the dream. Tony vigorously wiped his face. When he removed his hand, a Stark-esque smile was back on his face, and he opened the car door and stepped out. Hey, Lynn. You're much faster than I imagined. Tony greeted Lynn, showing no sign of being tormented by nightmares. Lynn calmly looked at Tony and slowly said, "Post-traumatic stress disorder." Tony's expression stiffened. He suddenly remembered Lynn's identity. A doctor who often took on shady jobs, helping mutants with treatment. A wry smile appeared on his face. "Buddy, you're just going to expose me like that? I'll lose a lot of face." Lynn looked at Tony Stark playfully, pinching his chin and saying, "When I saved you that day, you were clutching my hand, begging me to change the way I was holding you." Tony looked as if he'd been struck by lightning, his entire demeanor visibly dimming several shades. Ha. 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 Tony laughed awkwardly. "Did I?" Before Lynn could answer, he answered his own question. "No way." Lynn didn't respond, merely watching the other man with a teasing gaze. A blush of embarrassment and exasperation crept onto Tony's face, and he snapped, "Kid. That's enough." Lynn shrugged his shoulders. "How about it, do you feel any better?" Tony paused, and after realizing that the fear from his nightmare had completely dissipated, he felt a surge of gratitude towards Lynn, yet he stubbornly replied, "I've always been comfortable." Lynn didn't expose his Sunere facade, simply asking, "Where's the surprise you mentioned?" Although they hadn't exchanged contact information that day, it was incredibly easy for Tony Stark to find someone's contact details. So, when Tony Stark called him, Lynn wasn't surprised at all. Instead, he was wondering if he could turn Tony Stark into his first believer. After all, Tony Stark, as Iron Man, had a massive fan base. If Iron Man became his follower, as long as Tony Stark wished, he could convert many of Lynn's supporters from this vast fan base, providing him with a large amount of faith power. Cough. Tony cleared his throat and said to Lynn, "I know your clinic was destroyed in the war, so I want to give you a new clinic." Oh. Lynn raised an eyebrow, teasing, "When did Tony Stark switch to philanthropy?" "I've always done charity," Tony said with dissatisfaction. Seeing Lynn look at him suspiciously, he then said helplessly, "All right. I admit this is payment for you saving me." Oh. Lynn drew out the sound, his tone full of disappointment. So, the life of Tony Stark, a genius scientist, billionaire, playboy, and Iron Man, is only worth one clinic. Holy shit. You greedy black doctor. Tony glared at Lynn, but inwardly, he was overjoyed. His life was certainly worth more than any clinic. Anywhere in New York, you pick. Tony was secretly pleased, but he kept a straight face as he spoke. Seeing Lynn still looking at him askance, he helplessly said, "All right, this isn't payment for saving me. This is." He paused, lowering his voice, "a thank you gift for returning my Iron Man suit." Although that Iron Man suit was badly damaged, it also held significant sentimental value. Iron Man suit. Lynn was stunned for a moment, then laughed, "I completely forgot about that thing." Tony looked at Lynn meaningfully. "You think I believe that?" Lynn chuckled, pointing to a detached two-story house about 200 meters from the clinic's ruins. "That's the one. To have survived this war, that small building must have been blessed by the god of luck. Tony nodded and said directly, Jarvis, by that small building. Yes, Mr. Stark. Jarvis's voice came from the car. Lynn raised an eyebrow, experiencing Tony Stark's wealth firsthand for the first time. Minutes later, Jarvis's voice sounded again. Mr. Stark, that small building now belongs to you. Change the ownership to Lynn Crete. Tony said indifferently, then asked Lynn, do you need me to find someone to help you move? Lynn didn't stand on ceremony, nodding to Tony and saying, thank you for the trouble. He gestured with his chin towards the clinic ruins. There's not much to move anyway, just some medicine in the warehouse. Tony nodded. After delegating the task to Jarvis, he said to Lynn, come back to Avengers Tower with me. The Iron Man suit needs to be retrieved. Lynn smiled and nodded. As you wish, boss. Lynn wasn't visiting Stark Tower for the first time, but it was his first time entering through the main entrance. Oh, it had already been renamed Avengers Tower. Although it hadn't been officially announced, Tony was already calling it that. It will be officially renamed once the repairs are complete. Tony explained to Lynn, then led him into his private elevator, under the curious gazes of the staff. As the elevator slowly ascended, Tony raised an eyebrow and, with a proud expression, said to Lynn, how about it? Isn't this building magnificent? Once it's fully repaired, it will be even more. Like a boot. Lynn interrupted Tony expressionlessly. Tony's mouth twitched, and the rest of his sentence was swallowed back. Post-war anxiety. Just then, Lynn suddenly spoke. What? Tony didn't react for a moment and looked at Lynn in confusion. Lynn smiled and explained, your PTSD. I prefer to call it, post-war anxiety caused by insufficient firepower. Tony looked at Lynn in surprise. You didn't say anything on the way here. Were you thinking about my condition? Might as well, since I'm idle anyway. Lynn smiled slightly at Tony and teased, you just gave me an apartment, I should at least show some appreciation. Tony rolled his eyes but felt that what Lynn said made a lot of sense. Insufficient firepower. Just as he was pondering how to supplement his firepower, Lynn snapped his fingers. Hey. Lynn looked at the recovered Tony and said, protecting Earth isn't your responsibility alone. You don't have to bear the burden by yourself. Besides, Earth is much stronger than you imagine. Tony was stunned, and a warmth spread through his heart. He looked at Lynn with a suspicious gaze. Do you know something? Lynn smiled mysteriously and gave Tony a gesture that would drive the Koreans wild. A little bit. A hint of curiosity emerged in Tony's mind. Just as he was about to ask more questions, the elevator stopped. The elevator doors opened, and Lynn stepped out first, saying to Tony, I'm not a professional psychologist, so what I just told you can only be taken as a reference. Tony raised an eyebrow, followed Lynn out of the elevator, and quickly walked 2 steps to catch up with Lynn, also giving him the gesture that would drive the Koreans wild. I think it had a little effect on me. You should be proud. Lynn smiled, looking around with some surprise. It's already repaired. That was quite fast. He remembered that the damage to the top floor on the day of the New York battle still looked quite severe. I hired a construction team from East Asia, their efficiency is truly unparalleled. Tony explained, unable to help but praise, I feel that as long as I give them enough funds, they can meet all my requirements. Come with me. He nodded to Lynn and led him into the top floor workshop. Put the Iron Man suit here. Lynn nodded and said to Tony, I'll go get it for you. He took a step and disappeared from Tony's sight. While Tony was still curious about what Lynn's ability was, clang. The Iron Man suit's faceplate fell to the ground with a crisp sound. Tony picked up the faceplate and, seeing the heavily scarred Iron Man suit thrown out by Lynn, his eyes momentarily blurred. This scene felt somewhat familiar, as if it had happened before. Oh, right. He had encountered it many times before he became Iron Man, only it wasn't the Iron Man suit that was thrown out. Done. Check if any parts are missing. Lynn clapped his hands, as if dusting off non-existent dirt, and walked out of his inner world. Tony observed Lynn, and finally couldn't suppress his curiosity. So, where was that place I went last time? Is that your ability? Are you, a mutant? Yes. As for whether I'm a mutant, I'm not sure either. Although his mother was a mutant, his father was Zeus. Seeing Lynn's vague answer, Tony didn't press further. He controlled the robotic arm in the workshop, placed the Iron Man suit on the workbench, and gently stroked the scars on the suit, then suddenly asked. Interested in joining the Avengers? The Avengers? Lin rejected without thinking. Not interested for now. I'm not a superhero. The blunt refusal stunned Tony. Just as he was about to speak, a voice, full of positive energy, sounded from the workshop doorway. Superhero. The moment you stopped the nuclear bomb from exploding, you became the greatest superhero. Steve Rogers walked into the workshop, followed by a somewhat restrained Bruce Banner. Tony nodded to Steve and teased, "When did you develop a habit of eavesdropping?" Eavesdropping. Steve spread his hands and said helplessly, "Sorry, my hearing is just too good." Ha ha. Bruce Banner pushed up his black-rimmed glasses and said in his characteristic gentle voice. "I had some things I wanted your help with. I ran into Captain on the way and came over with him. I just happened to hear you inviting Lin to join the Avengers." He rubbed his hands a bit awkwardly, explaining in detail, as if afraid Tony would misunderstand. "Banner, you're too reserved." Tony looked at Bruce Banner helplessly and said, "I was just joking with Captain." Oh. Bruce Banner responded sheepishly, curiously observing Lin, who was standing nearby. At this moment, Tony looked at Lin seriously and extended the invitation again. "Join the Avengers. We need you." If Lin joined the Avengers, his insufficient firepower might be alleviated. Steve nodded to Lin, his eyes also full of expectation. Lin's gaze swept across the faces of the three, then he suddenly said playfully, "Do you know me? And you dare to pull me into the Avengers?" Lin Crete, 19 years old, a doctor at Crete Clinic, often provides help to mutants, and is deeply trusted by mutants. Your mother, Freya Crete, is the founder of Crete Clinic. Based on some activity traces of Freya Crete, I suspect she is a mutant. Tony detailed the information gathered through his investigation, then paused and continued, Your father, Mike Crete, is currently the director of the New York Police Department, but is recently preparing for retirement. When you were 3 years old, because you taught children socialism in kindergarten. Stop. Lin quickly called for a halt. If he didn't stop Tony Stark now, all the things he did out of boredom as a child would be revealed. He looked at the smug-faced Tony and slowly said, What I mean is, do you know my true identity? Do you know what kind of trouble that could bring? True identity. The three of them, Tony, Steve, and Bruce, were stunned, but then a smile appeared on their faces. Buddy, every Avenger's identity is extraordinary. Could your identity be even more incredible than Thor's? Tony joked. But Lin nodded with a normal expression. More or less. I am the son of Zeus. I am the son of Zeus. Silence fell in the room. Tony and the other two had stiff expressions. Another figure from mythology. At this moment, they thought of the 2 sons of Odin they had just sent off yesterday. And this Chitauri incident was caused by Loki, the son of Odin. Again. Bruce Banner stammered, taking 2 steps back in fear. You're really not joking. Steve frowned, looking at Lin. If that was the case, they really should take it seriously. PFF'd. Ha. Tony laughed. Lin, even if you want to refuse us, you don't need to find such an unreliable reason. He scrutinized Lin, making tisk sounds. So, what is your true identity? The sun god. The god of war. Or the god of fire. I only awakened recently. I'm not one of those old relics. Lin spread his hands at the 3 of them. Tony waved his hand, impatiently saying, Oh, come on. I've seen all your records from childhood to adulthood. He looked at Lin confidently. You were born on Earth, grew up on Earth, how could you be the son of Zeus? Unless your father, Mike Crete, is Zeus. He suddenly swallowed, his voice trailing off. It can't really be Zeus, can it? He whispered, observing Lin's expression. The real deal. Lin nodded calmly. Immediately, Tony and the other 2 felt their scalps tingle. This world seemed even more complex than they had imagined, so much so that they couldn't quite understand it anymore. Zeus was on Earth, and he even had a child. What was going on? Why would Zeus be on Earth? A series of thoughts flashed through their minds. You're really not joking. Tony still couldn't quite believe it. Lin smiled and said, I can't prove it to you, whether you believe it or not is up to you. Just then, Steve asked seriously, if what you say is true, why would Zeus be on Earth? I don't know. Lin shook his head helplessly. He was lying, but he didn't need to tell others about his father's predicament. Seeing the three of them look solemn, Lin also said seriously, but what I'm certain of is that he wouldn't do anything bad for Earth. Tony and Steve exchanged glances, feeling that this statement should have a high degree of credibility. After all, Zeus had been on Earth for many years. If he wanted to do anything, he would have done it long ago. New York Police Department Director, King Zeus. Tony muttered, unable to connect these two identities. I know. Bruce Banner suddenly yelled, his emotions agitated. He's been on Earth for so long, it must be for your mother. This is love. Banner, what you said makes a lot of sense. Tony was stunned for a moment, then stroked his chin and muttered, Zeus is known in mythology as a promiscuous god. It's possible for him to stay on Earth for so long for love. Just on the point of promiscuity, Zeus was practically his idol. Steve nodded in agreement. Lin's mouth twitched. So, this time his father's character design won. So what if he's the son of Zeus? Thor is also an Avenger, one more of you won't make a difference. The more Tony spoke, the more he felt that Lin's identity was not an issue, and he even felt that the decision to invite Lin to join the Avengers couldn't have been more correct. After Asgard became their ally, would Olympus also become their ally? Just thinking about this, Tony felt his anxiety ease considerably. No, you've forgotten one thing. Steve reminded, Hera. Hera, the Queen of Heaven in mythology, the goddess of marriage and childbirth, one of the 12 Olympian gods, Zeus's sister and wife, and this Queen of Heaven was famous for her jealousy. If this Queen of Heaven knew Lin's identity, how would she treat Lin and his mother? So this was the trouble Lin was talking about. A look of realization flashed in the eyes of Tony and the other two, and they couldn't help but cast sympathetic glances at Lin. Lin's eye twitched. He hadn't said anything, but the three of them solving their own problems saved him the trouble of explaining. Although the details were slightly off, the general direction was still correct. Ahem, pretty much. Lin responded, helplessly saying, as far as I know, people from Olympus will be coming in a month. I can't join the Avengers, it would bring you trouble. Faced with Lin's sincere answer, the three fell silent. Lin could have readily accepted their invitation to join the Avengers, dragging them into this mess. But Lin didn't do that. Lin was a good person. Lin. Tony put away his usual flippancy, if you need help, just contact me directly. I owe you one. When he failed to push the nuclear bomb through the space portal and was consumed by fear, regret, and unwillingness, Lin appeared and pulled him out of the abyss. At that time, Lin was simply an angel in his eyes. Steve and Banner exchanged glances and said to Lin, we all owe you one. Although I don't really feel like you owe me anything, but, thank you. Lin smiled and said to the three of them. Ding. Obtained the Avengers, friendship. Completed. If Lin had a system, such a sound would probably ring out at this moment. Originally, he only wanted to increase Tony's favorability, but he unexpectedly increased Steve's and Banner's favorability as well, which was a pleasant surprise. For these superheroes, emotion and friendship were always the best way to build deep bonds. In that case, if the people from Olympus appeared, his chances would be a bit higher. Lin muttered to himself, glancing at Tony. Unfortunately, the current Tony Stark probably couldn't become his follower. He was too self-centered and too proud. Even if he told Tony the secret of his parents' death, it wouldn't be enough for Tony to become his follower. Unless he could resurrect their parents. Lin muttered to himself. Although a little disappointed, at least he had now gained the trust and friendship of these three Avengers. The goal of this contact with Tony had been overachieved. A series of thoughts flashed through Lin's mind. For the rest of the time, Lin chatted very happily with the three of them, and after Tony suggested having a drink together, all three agreed. In the end, with Tony getting drunk alone and Banner getting full from drinking juice, the first gathering ended perfectly. Olympus. This was the main dwelling place of the Olympian gods, an independent dimension. At this moment, above the Olympus temple, in the shimmering sky, threads of starlight formed by responsibilities were condensing. When this star condensed and appeared, Lin's name would appear within it. And there were still 28 days until this star successfully condensed. The next day, Lin woke up early and went into the kitchen to prepare a Chinese-style breakfast. Just as he brought breakfast to the table, his father, Zeus, came out of the bedroom in his pajamas, yawning. This was, of course, no coincidence. Lin had timed it perfectly. Lin, you're up so early today. Zeus looked at his son, puzzled. Usually, he was the one who had to wake him up. The new clinic is already renovated, I'm going to check it out first. Lin explained, placing a cup of soy milk in front of Zeus. Zeus took a sip of the soy milk, which had a little sugar added, nodded in satisfaction, and asked curiously, that fast? Tony hired the East University renovation team and paid 3 times the market price, so. Lin shrugged, picked up a crispy fried dough stick, and put it in his mouth. At the Crete family, whoever woke up first prepared breakfast, and Lin naturally preferred Chinese-style breakfast. The East University renovation team is indeed efficient. Zeus praised, but then suddenly looked displeased and said, those renovation teams working with the police station are too lazy. If working slowly were a crime, they should be eaten by Cerberus. If it weren't for those fooled renovation companies and workers gathering to protest, Zeus would have long since handed all renovation projects under the police station to East University's renovation company. As far as he knew, one renovation project at the police station had been going on for 5 years and still wasn't finished. But, the Tony you mentioned, it wouldn't be Tony Stark, would it? Zeus glanced at Lin. Yes. Lin nodded. You joined the Avengers. Zeus frowned, and after taking a bite of the fried dough stick, feeling the mix of oil and wheat flavors, his brows quickly relaxed. No, but I have a good relationship with them now. Asking them for help with a fight or something shouldn't be a problem. Lin explained, then smiled at Zeus, if the people from Olympus come looking for trouble and I accidentally kill them, Dad, you can't feel bad, right? Lin looked innocent, his expression practically green tea. Zeus said indifferently, if they actively attack you and get killed by you, it's what they deserve. But I advise you not to do that, unless you're prepared to deal with the Olympus army. Zeus looked at Lin teasingly. Lin pressed his forehead and muttered, how troublesome. Zeus finished the fried dough stick in his hand and suddenly asked, Lin, how did you stop the nuclear bomb from exploding? Although no one filmed Lin stopping the nuclear bomb, with Zeus's position as director of the police station, he could naturally find some information, not to mention Tony's news report. I thought you weren't curious. Lin smiled, and after Zeus had prepared to listen, he said seriously, secret. Zeus was stunned for a moment, then shook his head with a smile, reminding Lin, 27 days left. Lin nodded and said lazily, got it. With that, he tidied up the dishes and walked towards the kitchen. Zeus watched Lin's retreating figure, a smile flashing in his eyes. It was only when he revealed his identity that day that this kid Lin seemed a little flustered. Now, after only 2 or 3 days, this kid had no sense of urgency at all. Either his strength exceeded his expectations, or he had already guessed that he could cover for him. But from his understanding of his son, it was probably both reasons, and with Lin's temper, there would absolutely be no situation where he would need him to cover for him. A thought flashed through Zeus's mind, and a look of doting appeared in his eyes. A moment later, Lin finished tidying the dishes, picked up his clothes, and walked out, but as he reached the door, Zeus's voice rang out. Come with me to George Stacy's house tonight. Lin paused, then said helplessly, do I have to go? George Stacy, director of the New York Police Department, was an old acquaintance of his father and also his father's subordinate. Your mom isn't home, you wouldn't want me to go to a family gathering alone, would you? Zeus emphasized the words, family gathering. No discussion then. Lin sighed helplessly. Got it, he said weakly. It seemed he still had to find an opportunity to move out on his own. But the next second, don't even think about it. Zeus popped his head out of the bathroom and grinned at Lin, your mom won't agree to you moving out on your own. Lin's expression stiffened, and he said helplessly, can't you try to persuade her? Zeus shrugged, no, I don't want to sleep in the living room alone. Like this, you don't look like a god king at all. Lin's disgust was unconcealed. Zeus said earnestly, I am Mike Crete now. Lin's mouth twitched, and he opened the door and walked out. Don't forget, be there at 6. Got it. Lin found an unnoticed corner, landed near the new clinic, and walked towards the new Crete clinic. This Chitauri invasion caused considerable damage to Manhattan. The 5 blocks centered around Stark Tower were the most severely damaged areas. Immediately after the war ended, Stark Industries and the government jointly established the Damage Control Company. But rebuilding this area would not be completed in a short time. So, I'll have to see this dilapidated site for quite a long time. Lin shook his head, his gaze falling on the new Crete Clinic in front of him. Amidst the surrounding damaged buildings, the Crete Clinic, with its spotless exterior walls, stood out like a sore thumb. This is the power of capital. Lin muttered. The new Crete Clinic was much larger than the original clinic and had become 2 stories. For a clinic, this area seemed a bit too large. So Lin only asked Tony to set up the first floor as a clinic, while the second floor was arranged as a living area. This was also why Lin wanted to move out. After all, leaving it empty would be too much of a waste. Lin opened the clinic door, and when he walked in, his expression froze slightly. The renovation was more luxurious than a private hospital. Everything was new and of the best quality, even the common laboratory instruments in the clinic were top-notch. That's right, in just one day, Tony not only finished the renovation but also helped him purchase many medical devices. Lin took a deep breath, as if smelling the scent of ink. The smell of money. With such a renovation, his patients would probably be afraid to enter. Lin chuckled softly, familiarizing himself with the clinic's new environment. When he had walked around and pushed open the clinic's new warehouse, preparing to check the medicines, he froze at the sight of the unconscious woman inside the warehouse. Smurf. Lin murmured, puzzled, how is she here? Mystique. Lin's eyes flashed with surprise, then he let out a long breath. He finally saw a familiar mutant. He had lived in this world for 19 years, but he had never heard of those mutants who should have been very famous, including but not limited to Magneto, Professor X, Wolverine, Storm, Cyclops, and so on. He even once doubted whether these celebrities would appear in this world. But now, Mystique's appearance invigorated him. Although the world might be different, these characters will still appear. This is truly great. A smile played on Lin's lips. In the world he was in, mutants had been discovered in large numbers and were seen as a threat to human society for only 19 years. Without the leaders among these mutants, the mutants' situation was much worse than in the X-Men movies. Especially with the establishment of the Sentinel services targeting mutants several years ago, mutants, who were already suffering from discrimination and unfair treatment, could barely live normal lives. The black market work that Crete Clinic took on was treating mutants, so he was very familiar with the mutants' plight. Wait, 19 years. This number was a bit subtle. It coincided with the time he arrived in this world. Lin narrowed his eyes, and a strange feeling surfaced in his heart. He gently pinched his brow, and after gathering his scattered thoughts, he walked over to Mystique, who was huddled in the corner. Injured this seriously? Lin looked at the pool of blood on the ground and frowned. So, Mystique came to his clinic for help because she was injured. A thought flashed through Lin's mind. He picked up Mystique, locked the clinic door, and strode towards the operating room. After preparing the surgical instruments, Lin began to operate on Mystique. Although he was alone, with Lin's currently enhanced body and mind, it was not a difficult task for him. However, Mystique's wound was more severe than imagined. The wound extended from her chest all the way to her abdomen. If it were an ordinary person or even most mutants, they would have died from such an injury long ago. It was only because Mystique's physical strength far exceeded that of ordinary people that she survived. Even so, if it weren't for Lin, the heavily injured Mystique wouldn't have lived past noon. Lin concentrated, completing the surgery for Mystique as quickly as possible. Mystique's vital signs had already stabilized. Today is your lucky day, Smurf. Lin chuckled softly. After pushing Mystique out of the operating room, he moved her into a temporary ward on the first floor. At this moment, as he looked at Mystique, some thoughts he had suppressed earlier reappeared in his mind. His follower had arrived. Is this like someone bringing a pillow when you're sleepy? Lin chuckled to himself. To turn someone into his follower wasn't just about talking. You had to provide them with meaning and purpose in life, offer comfort and hope, create a sense of belonging, and even demonstrate your own power, etc. This was also why he had set Tony as one of his targets but later gave up. Humans and mutants. Before seeing Mystique today, he was still hesitating about which group to develop his followers from. Humans had a large population base. As long as he started and everything went smoothly, it would snowball, developing a large number of followers in a short time. But the downside was that there were too many adherents of various religions among humans, almost 75% of the total population. If he were to develop his own followers, conflicts and exclusion would inevitably arise, and he would have to deal with all sorts of messy things. In contrast, mutants, apart from being few in number, perfectly fit the characteristics of quality followers. Meaning in life, hope, a sense of belonging, belief in individual power, etc. Moreover, if he developed followers based on mutants, it would only take a little time for him to gain a force that could not be ignored. Interestingly, this world was a world centered around superheroes. Every mutant follower had the potential to become a superhero. At that time, if they were to help him collect the power of faith as superheroes, it should be easier. A series of thoughts flashed through Lin's mind, and he made his decision. As for Mystique before him, her shape-shifting mutant ability, excellent intelligence-gathering skills, and formidable martial arts capabilities, she was simply too suitable for developing followers. A smile appeared on Lin's face, and his gaze towards Mystique grew increasingly fervent. Mystique, you are the chosen one. A smile appeared on Lin's lips. I hope the process of taking Mystique as a follower goes smoothly. Lin murmured. Ding, ding, ding. Suddenly, his phone rang. Lin glanced at the name, raised an eyebrow slightly, and answered the call. Lin, how is it? Still like it? Tony's playful voice came through the receiver. For some reason, Lin's mind conjured an image of a proud peacock desperately displaying its brilliant tail, seeking praise from him. Ha! It's great. I really like it. Thank you. Lin quickly stifled his laughter and expressed his gratitude. You were just laughing, weren't you? Tony asked suspiciously. No. Lin's lips curved upward, and he suddenly changed the subject. I especially like the layout of the second floor, particularly the bar and the wine cabinet. Ha ha. I think that idea is brilliant too. Tony laughed happily. Lin raised an eyebrow and asked, did you call just to confirm if I like this gift? Uh-huh. Tony vaguely responded. A series of clanking sounds came from the other end of the phone, and then Tony asked, what color do you like? Lin's mouth twitched, and he couldn't help but retort, dude. Shouldn't you be asking women these kinds of questions? Tony was silent for a moment, then said faintly, didn't I promise to give you an Iron Man suit to play with when we were drinking yesterday? Lin was taken aback, a little surprised. You actually remember. I thought you were just talking nonsense while drunk. Tony snorted softly. What Stark, say, I never go back on. Jarvis. He had forgotten, but after he sobered up, Jarvis helped him recall. Well, he couldn't really blame Jarvis for this. Because he was afraid of forgetting things, he had asked Jarvis to continue recording for him when he was incoherent. He would delete this command from Jarvis when he had free time. Tony muttered to himself, then said impatiently, hurry up. Choose a color. Lin chuckled softly. Whatever. Before he finished speaking, Tony hung up the phone. This guy, though a bit sharp-tongued, is quite good to me. Lin smiled and shook his head, estimating when Mystique would wake up. After a moment of contemplation, he left the clinic. Raven slowly opened her eyes, but all she saw was darkness. She cowered a little in fear, desperately searching for some comfort in the darkness. Just then, a beam of light appeared not far away. Bright, dazzling. Raven unconsciously moved her feet. But when she approached the light and cautiously extended her hand into it, a bone-chilling cold instantly spread from her fingertips throughout her entire body. No! Raven cried out in terror, but in the next instant, she was already on a cold operating table. She opened her mouth wide but couldn't make a sound. Terrified tears blurred her vision, and when a thick needle pierced her body to draw blood, when a sharp scalpel cut into her body, she lost all her strength. Once, twice. She was just a piece of meat, just an experimental subject. She seemed to have grown accustomed to being treated this way. But when her gaze met that of the person holding the scalpel, and she saw her numb self through their eyes, her heart suddenly pounded. She wanted to live. At least she shouldn't die like this. Die like a pig. She struggled violently, wailing. Her wounds tore open, and blood stained the operating table. She was like a beast that had lost its mind. Don't move. A strange voice suddenly rang out in the darkness. The words carried a hint of reproach, but also the warmth and concern she desperately craved. She dazedly searched for the source of the sound until she saw a beam of light, and then, instinctively and without hesitation, she reached out her hand. The darkness quickly receded, and a warm light entered her vision. Raven unconsciously squinted, then stared blankly at a face not far away. Reproach, concern, and warmth. Her tense body relaxed a little. Who are you? Where is this place? She spoke with difficulty, feeling as if her throat had been soaked in sulfuric acid. Lin released Raven's hand and smiled. I'm Lin, and this is Crete Clinic. You woke up much earlier than I expected. Lin. Crete Clinic. That's right, she was being hunted. She had barely escaped the pursuit but was severely injured. Just as she was in despair, she noticed the Crete Clinic in the ruins. So, she used her last bit of strength to sneak into the clinic's pharmacy, hoping to find some medicine for treatment. But she fainted before she could find any medicine. So, the person in front of her saved her. Thank you. Raven thanked him, her throat dry, sore, and torn. Her gaze unconsciously fell on her wound, and she secretly breathed a sigh of relief when she noticed that her wound had already been treated. You're welcome. Lin smiled, you're very lucky. If I had come 2 hours later, you would have died. Raven felt grateful, but her eyes were still full of vigilance. Lin walked to the IV stand, replaced Raven's IV bag, and sighed, it's only because your physical condition is good, otherwise, an ordinary person would have died from such injuries long ago. Good physical condition. Body. Raven's eyes narrowed sharply as if she had thought of something extremely terrifying. Her body under the blanket curled into a ball and began to tremble violently. Don't be afraid, it's just a mutation. That doesn't mean anything. Lin's warm voice was like a spring breeze, gently landing in Raven's heart. She cautiously raised her head to look at Lin. There was no fear, no disgust, and no greed. Lin simply looked at her calmly, as if looking at an ordinary person. She relaxed a little, at least her body no longer trembled, but she still tightly wrapped herself in the blanket. What's your name? Lin looked kindly at Mystique. Raven pursed her lips and whispered, Raven Darkholme. Raven, nice to meet you. Lin extended his hand to Raven. Raven froze. She looked at Lin's outstretched hand, completely at a loss. It had been a long time since anyone had called her by her name, and a long time since anyone had shown her friendliness. In the dark laboratory, she only had a number she loathed. She cautiously extended her own hand, but then eagerly grasped Lin's outstretched hand. So warm. Raven held Lin's hand tightly, somewhat greedily, and looked up at Lin. A gentle expression, a charming smile, and eyes full of pity. He was like that beam of light, the light she had longed for, the light that saved her from the darkness. Raven stared blankly at Lin, her mind a blank. But when Lin withdrew his hand, a hint of panic flashed in her eyes, and she suddenly woke up. She instinctively reached out to Lin, wanting to grasp that receding light, but Lin gently patted her head. Lie still. You're still injured. Raven nodded obediently, as if she had turned into a puppet. A few seconds later, she fully recovered, but her gaze seemed glued to Lin, constantly following him. With your physical condition, your injuries should be mostly healed within a week. Oh. Raven responded blankly. You still can't eat anything today. Oh. Raven licked her lips, and a look of urgency flashed in her eyes as if she remembered something. Do you have any medicine here that can speed up my recovery? She couldn't stay here for too long, or the beast would catch up. Medicine to speed up recovery. Lin raised an eyebrow. Raven nodded and whispered, they injected me with it a few times when I was there before. To allow her to undergo research repeatedly, the experimenters needed her body to recover to a healthy state in a short time. That kind of medicine isn't good for your body. Lin said in a deep voice. Super Soldier Serum. Lin naturally knew about this medicine, he even had some in his clinic. This was a drug developed by Oscorp that could temporarily stimulate the body's potential and enhance combat ability. As long as the dosage was precisely controlled, it could be used to help severely injured people recover and save lives in critical moments. But even so, it would still cause some harm to people and could even lead to death. Therefore, Lin would not use this medicine on his patients unless it was absolutely necessary. Due to its powerful side effects, this medicine had caused many medical accidents. And some time ago, due to public pressure, Oscorp had announced that it would no longer produce this drug, so it was becoming increasingly rare on the market. This also led to the drug becoming more and more expensive in the underworld. Please, inject me. Raven said eagerly. I must recover as soon as possible. I can handle it. There won't be any side effects for me. She looked at Lin almost pleadingly. Lin hesitated for a few seconds, then nodded. I can only inject you with the lowest dose you can tolerate. With your physical condition, your wounds should be mostly healed by tomorrow. Raven opened her mouth, wanting Lin to increase the dosage, but noticed Lin's stern gaze. Instantly, she lowered her head like a child who had done something wrong and whispered, okay. Just one night, it should be fine. The sun was about to set, and an orange-red light streamed through the window, falling upon Raven. She felt the warmth of the afterglow on her body, her eyes fixed on the ward door, as tranquil as a cat. Just as her eyelids grew heavy and were about to close, the ward door was pushed open, and a figure, whose mere sight brought her warmth, appeared before her. Lin, she silently repeated his name in her heart. Although she still couldn't let down all her guard, every one of Lin's actions made her trust him more and more. Your injuries have recovered quite a bit. You can eat something now. Lin placed a dinner tray on the small table by the hospital bed. While Raven was still unconscious after her surgery, Lin took some time to buy groceries. Originally, he had prepared them for tomorrow, but who knew Raven would request a body-enhancing serum, and moreover, insist on the injection even after knowing about the terrible side effects. After injecting the serum, Raven, whose self-healing ability was already far superior to ordinary people, recovered significantly from her injuries in just a few short hours. Was Raven so eager to regain her mobility because of the people hunting her? A thought flashed through Lin's mind. As Raven struggled to sit up, he helped her and casually placed a pillow behind her back. Thank you. Raven thanked him, her gaze immediately drawn by the enticing aroma. This is special Chinese hospital food from Crete Clinic. I wonder if you'll get used to it. Yes. Raven nodded immediately. A small bowl of rice porridge, a plate of green vegetables, and a sliced apple. A perfect Chinese-style hospital meal. Eat a little less, you haven't fully recovered yet. Lin said with a smile, then sat down on a nearby chair. Raven nodded, and as she took the first bite of warm porridge, that warm feeling spread from her mouth all the way to her heart, and her eyes suddenly welled up. But the next instant, she quickly used her mutant ability to control the tears from flowing, almost burying her head in the bowl. Lin watched this scene, filled with emotion. What had she been through to have her emotional defenses broken by a hospital meal? Ding ding ding. Lin's phone suddenly rang. He glanced at the number, his eyelids twitching. It was his dad. Oh no. He forgot about tonight's dinner party. His dad placed great importance on punctuality. He took a deep breath, making his breathing slightly more hurried, then answered the call. Lin. Zeus's furious roar came through the phone. Lin quickly replied in an anxious tone, Dad, I'm stuck in traffic. I'll be there right away. There was a few seconds of silence on the other end, and the previously angry voice turned gloomy. You can fly, can't you? Ah, I forgot. Hee hee. Listening to the sneer, a cold sweat appeared on Lin's forehead. You have 3 minutes. Zeus said coldly, then hung up the phone. Lin let out a sigh of relief, seeing Raven looking at him curiously. Cough. I have something to do and need to leave. You rest well here. As he spoke, he took out a pen and paper from his jacket, wrote down his phone number, and handed it to Raven. Call me if anything happens. With that, he quickly packed up the dishes and strode out of the ward. Raven watched Lin leave, her body tensing up again. Although she knew it would become increasingly dangerous to stay here, she thought, tomorrow, after my injuries heal, I'll say goodbye to Lin and leave. She murmured in her heart, hid her head under the blanket, and soon fell asleep. Lin sped through the sky, flying towards Daisy's apartment. The Raven in this world was much younger and weaker than Mystique in the plot. Not weaker in terms of mutant abilities, but in terms of mindset and experience. This Raven was like a small flame battered by wind and rain. What exactly did she go through before? Lin murmured, a hint of curiosity rising in his heart. Just as he flew near Daisy's house and was about to find an inconspicuous corner to land, his pupils suddenly contracted. Is that Spider-Man? He looked at the figure wearing a black and white Spider-Man suit, swinging on webs between buildings, surprise flashing in his eyes. As his gaze fell on Spider-Man, he also sensed his gaze and immediately looked up into the air, and Spider-Man's excellent vision clearly saw Lin's face. Spider-Man, wearing the black and white suit, shivered, almost losing his grip on the web and falling from midair. Lin chuckled inwardly, waved at Spider-Man, and under his gaze, openly landed near Daisy's apartment. Watching this scene, Spider-Man in the black and white suit, thwacked against the wall and slid down weakly. Lin descended from the air and walked towards Daisy's house. His father and Chief Daisy had been old friends for over 10 years, and their relationship had always been good, so the relationship between the two families was also maintained well. That little girl must be panicking right now, right? Just thinking about Gwen Daisy's expression when she saw him later, Lin felt an inexplicable anticipation. However, was Spider-Man in this world Gwen? Lin muttered to himself, stood in front of Daisy's door, tidied his clothes, and then knocked. Knock knock. I'll get it. As soon as the door was knocked, a vibrant voice rang out. Gwen Daisy quickly ran to the door. Although it was only a few steps, her heart was pounding. Had her little secret been discovered? It shouldn't be, right? She was wearing a mask, and she had already returned home first, but if her identity hadn't been discovered, why would he wave at her? It should just be a friendly greeting. Right. It must be. Gwen comforted herself, put on an impeccable smile, and then opened the door for Lin. Brother Lin. I missed you so much. Gwen hugged Lin, but Lin smiled and said, didn't we just see each other? Gwen's face paled, a cold sweat appearing on her forehead, but she feigned confusion, no. It's been about a month since we last met. Is that so? Lin looked at Gwen with a half smile. Just as the smile on Gwen's face was about to falter, Lin shrugged. Perhaps I remembered wrong. Gwen chuckled, not daring to look at Lin, and turned to walk towards the living room. Brother Lin is here. Lin quickly took 2 steps to catch up with Gwen. We haven't chatted in a long time. Let's talk later. Upon hearing this, Gwen's face instantly fell. It's over. He really knows my identity. But, maybe not. Perhaps he just wants to have a simple chat with me. Gwen still held a glimmer of hope. Your collar is showing. Lin said to Gwen, smiling as he walked into the living room. Gwen quickly touched her neck. But the next instant, she reacted. She had already taken off her suit, so how could it be showing? I was tricked. Woo woo woo. He really knows. The dining table was laden with various delicacies. But for Lin, delicacies didn't mean delicious food, they meant US food. Macaroni, fried chicken, pineapple pie, steak. For this family dinner, Mrs. Stacy had prepared a feast, almost bringing out all her signature dishes. Dad. Lin greeted Zeus with a cheeky smile. Zeus responded coolly, his expression a bit sour. Seeing this, Lin let out a sigh of relief. If he could make a sound, then everything was fine. Fortunately, he wasn't late for the second 3-minute window, otherwise, he might have been punished by his father. He vaguely remembered the last time he was punished for being late was when he was 13 years, 3 months, and 8 days old. For being late for school, his father took him to the police station, and he trained there for half a month. Heaven knows how he endured it back then, as he hadn't awakened his abilities. Sorry, George Stacy, for making you all wait. Lin quickly apologized. Your dad is too strict, George Stacy said with a smile, then turned to Zeus. Lin is already very outstanding, you shouldn't be too strict. Hey. Zeus raised his eyelids, but looked at Gwen instead. Gwen is also very outstanding, aren't you just as strict? Mrs. Stacy rolled her eyes at both of them and said, that's enough, you two. She looked at Lin gently. Come, sit down, don't mind them. Lin gratefully said, thank you, Aunt Stacy. After Lin and Gwen sat down, and after the Stacy family finished their pre-meal prayer, everyone enjoyed the dinner Mrs. Stacy had meticulously prepared, not stinting on the compliments. As time passed, after Zeus and the other two had a few drinks, the atmosphere at the dinner table became increasingly lively and peculiar. Lin's gaze swept over Mr. and Mrs. Stacy, seeing that their attitude towards his father was more enthusiastic than usual, and he couldn't help but shake his head inwardly. Who said foreigners don't understand social etiquette? He glanced at Gwen, who was sitting beside him, and upon seeing her preoccupied, stirring her macaroni into a shape resembling pig slop, he subtly raised an eyebrow. Gwen noticed Lynn's gaze, looked up at him, and because of her inner turmoil, her beautiful little face looked as unpleasant as if she had eaten a bitter melon. Hee hee. She forced a smile at Lynn, and when Lynn kept a straight face and didn't respond, her heart jumped to her throat again. Finally, after a difficult and long hour, Gwen pushed her plate away. I'm full, I'm going back to my room, she said with a smile, then got up and walked towards her room. Just then, Helen Stacy suddenly spoke up. Gwen, don't you have some problems you haven't solved? Your brother Lynn is here, let him help you. Ah, no need, all right. Gwen noticed her mother's look and quickly changed her words, saying to Lynn, sorry to trouble you, brother Lynn. Lynn nodded with a smile. Evidently, Mrs. Stacy wanted to send him away to create an environment for George Stacy and his father to talk. Gwen, with a sullen face, led Lynn to her room, and the moment she closed the door, she suddenly clasped her hands tightly in front of her chest. Brother Lynn, please keep my secret. Lynn blinked and smiled. What secret? Gwen pursed her lips, and seeing Lynn's face full of teasing, she stammered, It's. You still have that poster. Lynn looked at the signed Queen poster on the wall and asked with some surprise. This was a gift he gave to his little sister 3 years ago when he started his Black Doctor career. He remembered Gwen was still an elementary school student back then. Gwen was stunned, a smile appearing on her face. I really like this poster. Lynn pulled a chair from beside the desk and sat down, observing the former little girl, and sighed, my little shadow has grown up, she's a middle school student now. Upon hearing this, Gwen's constantly anxious heart suddenly settled. She rolled her eyes and grumbled, what, little shadow? That sounds awful. The first time she and Lynn met was when she was 6, and Lynn was 11 at the time. The first time she saw Lynn, she was captivated by his cool and handsome appearance, and she idolized him. Whenever their two families had dinner together, she would follow Lynn like a lovesick puppy, even secretly vowing that any future boyfriend had to be as handsome as Lynn. As she entered middle school, her studies became increasingly busy, and the family gatherings became less frequent, causing her and her neighbor brother to grow more distant. But even if it was true, did that mean she could say it? Gwen glared at Lynn, huffing. Lynn looked at the pouting Gwen and pinched her cheek. Hey! Don't pinch my face. Gwen slapped Lynn's hand away and looked at him irritably. When did it start? Lynn dropped his smile and looked at Gwen seriously. Gwen pursed her lips, sat on the bed, and gently swung her legs. You promise not to tell anyone else, and I'll tell you. Okay. Lynn nodded, immediately agreeing. Gwen recalled her experience and summarized it in extremely brief words. Half a month ago, when our class visited Osborne Industries, I was bitten by a spider, and then I awakened superpowers. Oh. Lynn subtly raised an eyebrow. This was Spider-Man's classic origin story. What Lynn was concerned about was, if Gwen was bitten by a spider and became Spider-Woman, then what about Peter? In one version he remembered quite clearly, after Gwen became Spider-Man, Peter became the lizard. What about this world? Lynn was a bit curious, but, if Peter really became the lizard, he would have to find a way to change the original outcome. Because he also knew that kid, Peter. May Parker was an old employee of Crete Clinic. A few years ago, Ben Parker passed away from illness, and May Parker often brought that kid Peter to the clinic. He needed to find some time to visit that kid and confirm his identity. After all, both Gwen and Peter could be said to have grown up under his watchful eye. Lynn muttered to himself, sighing helplessly in his heart. He felt like things were getting more and more complicated. But whether it was Gwen or Peter, they both seemed very suitable to be tricked into working for him. Spider-Man Saint. Cosmic Spider-Man. Tisk, that sounds like it could be very interesting. Lynn narrowed his eyes and smiled at Gwen. Don't smile like that, I'm scared. Gwen hugged herself, trembling. Ahem. Lynn lightly coughed and asked again, how long have you been wearing that outfit? It was just finished today, and you saw it. Gwen pouted and said, then curiously asked, can you fly? That's my ability. Lynn responded, and seeing Gwen staring at him with shining eyes, he smiled and ruffled her head, briefly explaining his own situation. A moment later, as the two were chatting happily, Zeus's voice rang out. Lynn, time to go home. Coming. Lynn responded, and said to Gwen, wait for my call. Okay. Gwen nodded happily. Sharing her secret with Lynn had made her feel much lighter. Lynn pinched Gwen's cheek, and amidst Gwen's displeased cries, he opened the door and walked out. Lynn lay leisurely in the passenger seat, comfortably enjoying the treatment of having the director of the police station as his driver. Zeus glanced at Lynn and said grumpily, next time, you drive. He had been driving for this kid since he was in diapers, and now that he was all grown up, Zeus was still his driver. Hee hee. Lynn chuckled and said, do you remember when you drove the police car to pick me up from school when I was a kid? I remember. Zeus nodded, unable to help but laugh. The next day, the news that you had been arrested by the police spread throughout the entire school. Lynn's lips curved upwards, his face full of nostalgia. Ever since he transmigrated to this world, he had lived a very comfortable life, much happier than his previous life's pleasant goat-style childhood. Time flies so fast, you're about to retire. Lynn couldn't help but sigh. Zeus glanced at Lynn and suddenly said, your life is still very, very long. Time is the last thing you need to be sentimental about. Is that so? Lynn said softly, then suddenly asked, so, has the matter of the next director been decided? George Stacy. Although it wasn't very obvious, from the moment he entered until he left, he could feel George's flattery towards Zeus. However, Lynn didn't think there was anything shameful about it, it was human nature. George Stacy was a good police captain, there was no doubt about that, but being just a good police wouldn't get him the position of captain, let alone a candidate for director. If there are no surprises, it will be that kid. Zeus said indifferently, pointing his thumb over his shoulder towards the back seat. The gifts they sent, there's a share for you. Is that so? Lynn raised an eyebrow, not surprised. He looked back. A watch and wine. Tisk tisk, Uncle George really went all out, but. Lynn mumbled, pinching his chin, it's much less than what the other candidates sent. Ha ha. Zeus chuckled and said, George is a good police captain, he's usually much lighter-handed than those others, and his family fortune is much smaller. Lynn nodded in agreement and turned to look out the window. It's going to rain. Zeus said indifferently. No sooner had he spoken than a bolt of lightning streaked across the night, illuminating Lynn's face reflected in the car window. Boom. Thunder suddenly roared, accompanied by a sudden surge of strong wind, and large raindrops, the size of beans, pelted the window. So sudden. Lynn was a little surprised, and seeing Zeus's expressionless face, he muttered softly, HMPH, he's really good at fooling it. Bang. Zeus slapped Lynn's head and said in a low, authoritative voice, I haven't settled the score with you for being late today. Lynn immediately closed his mouth, propped his chin with one hand, and turned to look out the window. Seeing this, Zeus grinned with satisfaction. Rumble. The thunder rumbled incessantly, and this sudden storm showed signs of growing even larger. Lynn looked at the clouds, which became increasingly sinister in the flashing lightning, and his brows furrowed slightly, a bad premonition suddenly rising in his heart. That little fire should be fine, right? Lynn was silent for a few seconds, then suddenly said, Dad, you go back first. I'm going to the clinic, there's still a patient there. Zeus looked at the lightning and thunder in the sky and asked in confusion, now? Lynn responded, pulled open the car door, and flew out of the car like a blurred shadow, thoughtfully closing the door behind him. This kid isn't even afraid of being struck by lightning. Zeus muttered, watching Lynn soar into the sky, his light blue eyes flickering, as if golden lightning was rising within them. But the next moment, when he saw Lynn, as if bathed in lightning, directly passing through the clouds, a look of surprise flashed across his face, and the golden lightning in his eyes quietly dissipated. He seems to be stronger than I imagined. Zeus said indifferently, a happy smile involuntarily appearing on his face. Just as Lynn flew towards the clinic, Raven inside the clinic was startled awake by the thunder. Her amber-like eyes flickered in the darkness, and her pupils elongated like those of a feline. In an instant, the darkness was no longer dark. She blinked, habitually looked around, and seeing nothing, she closed her eyes again. The sleep she had in the Crete clinic was the most peaceful and comfortable sleep she had had since becoming a mutant. She liked this feeling very much, even to the point of craving it. Soon, her consciousness became blurred, and just as she yawned and was about to fall asleep, boom! The thunder rumbled again, startling Raven awake. Just as a bolt of lightning streaked across the sky, bringing a brief light to the dark ward, she saw a pair of eyes like those of a beast. It's him. Raven's heart jumped, and fear appeared in her eyes. The next moment, those beast-like eyes gleamed with ferocity and rushed towards Raven. Without any hesitation, Raven immediately leapt from the bed, stomped hard on the bed, flipped over, and landed lightly like a cat. Ha! Accompanied by an angry roar, the beast in the darkness lunged, directly leaping over the bed and pouncing on Raven, and during the pounce, a pair of sharp claws sprang from his fingertips. Hiss! The sharp claws pierced the ground, but Raven had already rushed towards the clinic window. HMPH. With a cold snort, the beast pounced on Raven again with even greater speed. Listening to the commotion behind her, a cold glint flashed in Raven's eyes, and just as the opponent's claws were about to pierce her, her body suddenly shrank by a foot. Hiss! The sharp blades cut through the air, almost grazing Raven's head, bringing with them a bone-chilling coldness. The next moment, Raven's body slid along the ground from under the opponent, and before that beast could land and stand firm, a scissor kick landed on the enemy's ankle. The beast lost its balance and fell forward. Raven's body suddenly sprang up, kicking the beast in the back. Crash! That beast was kicked out of the window by Raven. But Raven didn't dare to stay for a second. She knew how terrifying this beast was. He wouldn't die, wouldn't tire, and had indestructible claws. She rushed out of the ward and locked the door. Before she could catch her breath, 3 gleaming sharp claws had already pierced through the wooden door and appeared before her. Raven cursed under her breath and ran down the corridor towards the outside. Boom! Accompanied by a roar, that beast destroyed the door with 2 claws, smashing it to pieces, then roared and chased after her again. Raven ran towards the clinic door at top speed. She was no match, and even with the opponent's keen sense of smell, no matter what she transformed into, she would be recognized. Unfortunately, there's no way to say goodbye to him, Raven murmured in her heart and suddenly opened the clinic door. But the next second, she froze. She saw Lin, as if enveloped in lightning, landing in front of her. Leave it to me, Lin said indifferently, looking at the rushing beast, his eyebrows raised slightly. Wolverine. Thanks for watching.